Title: The Curly Tops on Star Island, or Camping Out with Grandpa. Author: Howard Roger Garis. Chapter 1. The Blue Light. Mother, make Ted stop. I'm not doing anything at all, Mother. Yes, he is, too. Please call him in. He's hurting my doll. Oh, Janet Martin, I am not. You are so Theodore Barradale Martin, and you've just got to stop. Janet, or Jan, as she was more often called, stood in front of her brother with flashing eyes and red cheeks. Children, what are you doing now? Asked their mother, appearing in the doorway of the big, white farmhouse, holding in her arms a small boy. Please don't make so much noise. I've just gotten baby William to sleep, and if he wakes up, yes, don't wake up trouble, Jan, added Theodore or Ted, the shorter name being the one by which he was most often called. If you do, he'll want to come with us, and we can't make knick-knack race. I wasn't waking him up, it was you, exclaimed January. He keeps pulling my doll's legs, Mother, and I only pulled Em a little bit, just to see if they had any springs in Em. Jan said her doll was a circus lady and could jump on the back of a horse. I wanted to see if she had any springs in her legs. Well, I'm pretending she has, so there, Ted Martin. And if you don't stop, there now, please stop, both of you, and be nice, begged Mrs. Martin. I thought, since you had your goat and wagon, you could play without having so much fuss. But if you can't, oh, we'll be good, exclaimed Ted, running his hands through his tightly curling hair. But not taking any of the kinks out that way. We'll be good. I won't tease Jana anymore. You'd better not, warned his sister, and, though she was a year younger than Ted, she did not seem at all afraid of him. If you do, I'll take my half of the goat away, and you can't ride. Pooh! Which is your half? Asked Ted. The wagon. And if you don't have the wagon to hitch knick-knack to, how are you going to ride? Huh. I could ride on his back. Take your old wagon if you want to, but if you do, the odor, exclaimed his mother in a slow, warning voice, and when he heard his name spoken in that way, with each syllable pronounced separately, Ted knew it was time to haul down his quarreling colors and behave. He did it this time. I'm sorry, he faltered. I didn't mean that, January. I won't pull your doll's legs anymore. And I won't take the goat wagon away. We'll both go for a ride in it. That's the way to have a good time, said Mrs. Martin with a smile. Now don't make any more noise, for William is fussy. Run off and play now, but don't go too far. We'll go for a ride, said Teddy. Come on, January. You can let your doll Maple-Leaf drive the goat if you want to. Thank you, Teddy. But I guess I'd better not. I'll pretend she's a Red Cross nurse and I'm taking her to the hospital to work. Then we'll make believe the goat wagon is an ambulance, exclaimed Ted. And I'm the driver and I don't mind the big guns. Come on, that'll be fun. Filled with the new idea, the two children hurried around the side of the farmhouse out toward the barn where Knick-Knack, their pet goat, was kept. Mrs. Martin smiled as she saw them go. Well, they'll be quiet for a little while, she said, and William can have his sleep. What's the matter, Ruth? Asked an old gentleman coming up the walk just then. Have the Curly Tops been getting into mischief again? No. Teddy and Janet were just having one of their little quarrels. It's all over now. You look tired, Father. Grandpa Martin was Mrs. Martin's husband's father, but she loved him as though he were her own. Yes, I am tired. I've been working pretty hard on the farm, said Grandpa Martin, but I'm going to rest a bit now. Want me to take Trouble? He asked as he saw the little boy in his mother's arms. Baby William was called Trouble because he got into so much of it. No, thank you. He's asleep, said Mother Martin. But I do wish you could find some way to keep Ted and Jan from disputing and quarreling so much. Oh, they don't act half as bad as lots of children. No, indeed. They're very good, I think, said Grandma Martin, coming to the door with a patch of flour on the end of her nose, for it was baking day. As you could easily have told had you come anywhere near the big kitchen of the White House on Cherry Farm. They need to be kept busy all the while, said Grandpa Martin. It's been a little slow for them here this vacation since we got in the hay and gathered the cherries. I think I'll have to find some new way for them to have fun. I didn't know there was any new way, said Mother Martin with a laugh as she carried baby William into the bedroom and came back to sit on the porch with Grandpa and Grandma Martin. Oh yes, there are lots of new ways. I haven't begun to think of them yet, said Grandpa Martin. I'm going to have a few weeks now with not very much to do until it's time to gather the fall crops. And I think I'll try to find some way of giving your curly tops a good time. Yes, that's what I'll do. I'll keep the curly tops so busy they won't have a chance to think of pulling Doll's legs or taking Knick-Knack, the goat, away from his wagon. What are you planning to do, Father? Asked Grandma Martin of her husband. Well, I promised to take them camping on Star Island, you know. What? Not those two little tots, not Ted and Jan, cried Grandma Martin, looking up in surprise. Yes, indeed, those same curly tops. It was easy to understand why Grandpa Martin, as well as nearly everyone else, called the two Martin children curly tops. It was because their hair was so tightly curling to their heads. Once Grandma Martin lost her thimble in the hair of one of the children, and their locks were curled so nearly alike that she never could remember on whose head she found the needle pusher. Do you think it will be safe to take Ted and Jan camping? Asked Mother Martin. Why, yes. There's no finer place in the country than Star Island. And if you go along, am I to go? Asked Ted's mother. Of course. And Trouble, too. It'll do you all good. I wish Dick could come, too, went on Grandpa Martin, speaking of Ted's father, who had gone from Cherry Farm for a few days to attend to some matters at a store he owned in the town of Cresco. But Dick says he'll be too busy, so I guess the curly tops will have to go camping with Grandpa, added the farmer, smiling. Well, I'm sure they couldn't have better fun than to go with you, replied Mother Martin. But I'm not sure that baby William and I can go. Oh, yes you can, said her father-in-law. We'll talk about it again. But here come Ted and Jan now in the goat cart. They seem to have something to ask you. We'll talk about the camp later. Teddy and Janet Martin, the two curly tops, came riding up to the farmhouse in a small wagon drawn by a fine, big goat that they had named Knick-Knack. Please, Mother, begged Ted, may we ride over to the home and get Hal? We promised to take him for a ride, added January. Yes, I suppose you may go, said Mother Martin. But you must be careful and be home in time for supper. We will, promised Ted. We'll go by the wood road, and then we won't get run over by any automobiles. They don't come on that road. All right. Now remember, don't stay too late. No, we won't, chorused the two children. And down the garden path and along the lane they went to a road that led through Grandpa Martin's woodlot and so on to the home for crippled children, which was about a mile from Cherry Farm. Among others at the home was a lame boy named Hal Chester. That is, he had been lame when the Curlytops first met him early in the summer, but he was almost cured now and walked with only a little limp. The home had been built to cure lame children and had helped many of them. Halfway to the big red building, which was like a hospital, the Curlytops met Hal, the very boy whom they had started out to see. "Hello, Hal," cried Ted. "Get in and have a ride." "Thanks, I will. I was just coming over to see you. Anyway, what are you two going to do?" "Nothing much," Ted answered, while Jan moved along the seat with her doll to make room for Hal. "What are you going to do?" "Same as you." The three children laughed at that. "Let's ride along the river road," suggested Janet. "It'll be nice and shady there. And if my Red Cross doll is going to the war, she'll like to be cool once in a while." "Is your doll a Red Cross nurse?" asked Hal. "If she is, where's her cap and the Red Cross on her arm?" "Oh, she just started to be a nurse a little while ago," Jan explained. "I haven't had time to make the Red Cross yet, but I will. Anyhow, let's go down by the river." "All right, we will," agreed Ted. "We'll see if we can get some sticks off the willow trees and make whistles," he added to Hal. "You can make better whistles in the spring, when the bark is softer than you can now," said the lame boy, as the Curlytops often called him, though Hal was nearly cured. "Well, maybe we can make some now," suggested Ted. And a little later the two boys were seated in the shade under the willow trees that grew on the bank of a small river which flowed into Clover Lake, not far from Cherry Farm. Knick-Knack, tied to a tree, nibbled the sweet, green grass, and Jan made a wreath of buttercups for her doll. After they had made some whistles, which did give out a little tooting sound, Ted and Hal found something else to do, and Jan saw, coming along the road, a girl named Mary Seton with whom she often played. Jan called Mary to join her, and the two little girls had a good time together while Ted and Hal threw stones at some wooden boats they made and floated down the stream. "Oh, Ted, we must go home," suddenly cried January. "It's getting dark." The sun was beginning to set, but it would not really have been dark for some time, except that the western sky was filled with clouds that seemed to tell of a coming storm. So, really, it did appear as though night were at hand. "I guess we'd better go," Ted said, with a look at the dark clouds. "Come on, Hal. There's room for you, too, Mary, in the wagon." "Can Knick-Knack pull us all?" Mary asked. "I guess so. It's mostly downhill. Come on." The four children got into the goat wagon, and if Knick-Knack minded the bigger load, he did not show it, but trotted off rather fast. Perhaps he knew he was going home to a stable where he would have some sweet hay and oats to eat, and that was what made him so glad to hurry along. The wagon was stopped near the home long enough to let Hal get out, and a little later Mary was driven up to her gate. Then Ted and Jan, with the doll between them, drove on. "Oh, Ted," exclaimed his sister, Mother'll scold. "We oughtn't to have stayed so late. It's past supper time. We didn't mean to. Anyhow, I guess they'll give us something to eat. Grandma baked cookies today, and there'll be some left." "I hope so," replied Jan with a sigh. "I'm hungry." They drove on in silence a little farther, and then As they came to the top of a hill and could look down towards Star Island in the middle of Clover Lake, Ted suddenly called, "Look, Jan." "Where?" she asked. "Over there." And her brother pointed to the island. "Do you see that blue light? On the island? Do you mean?" "Yes, I see it. Maybe somebody's there with a lantern." "Nobody lives on Star Island. Besides, who'd have a blue lantern?" Jan did not answer. It was now quite dark, and down in the lake, where there was a patch of black which was Star Island, could be seen a flickering blue glow that seemed to stand still and then move about. "Maybe it's lightning bugs," suggested January. "Huh, fireflies are sort of white," exclaimed Ted. "I never saw a light like that before." "Me either, Ted." "Hurry up home." Gadap, Knick-Knack, and Jan threw at the goat a pine cone, one of several she had picked up and put in the wagon when they were taking a rest in the woods that afternoon. Knick-Knack gave a funny little wiggle to his tail, which the children could hardly see in the darkness, and then he trotted on faster. The Curly Tops, looking back, had a last glimpse of the flickering blue light as they hurried toward Cherry Farm, and they were a little frightened. "What do you suppose it is?" asked January. "I don't know," answered Ted. "We'll ask Grandpa." "Go on, Knick-Knack." Chapter 2, What the Farmer Told. "Well, where in the world have you children been? Didn't you know we'd be worried about you? Did you get lost again?" Mother Martin, Grandpa Martin, and Grandma Martin took turns asking these 3 questions as Ted and Jan drove up to the farmhouse in the darkness a little later. "You said you wouldn't stay late," went on Mother Martin as the Curly Tops got out of the goat wagon. "We didn't mean to, Mother," said Ted. "Oh, but we're so scared," exclaimed Jan. And as Grandma Martin put her arms about the little girl, she felt Jan's heart beating faster than usual. "Why, what is the matter?" asked the old lady. "Me wants a wide with Knick-Knack," demanded baby William as he stood beside his mother in the doorway. "No trouble." "Not now," answered Ted. "Knick-Knack is tired and has to have his supper. Is there any supper left for us?" he asked eagerly. "Well, I guess we can find a cold potato, or something like it, for such tramps as you," laughed Grandpa Martin. "But where on earth have you been, and what kept you?" Then Ted put Knick-Knack in the barn. But when he came back, he and Jan between them told of having stayed playing later than they meant to. "Well, you got home only just in time," said Mother Martin as she took the children to the dining room for a late supper. "It's starting to rain now." And so it was, the big drops pelting down and splashing on the windows. "But what frightened you, Jan?" asked Grandma Martin. "It was a queer blue light on Star Island." "A light on Star Island," exclaimed her grandfather. "Nonsense. Nobody stays on the island after dark unless it's a fisherman or 2, and the fish aren't biting well enough now to make anyone stay late to try to catch them." "You must have dreamed it or made believe." "No, we really saw it," declared Ted. "It was a flickering blue light." "Well, if there's any such thing there as a flickering blue light, we'll soon find out what it is," said Grandpa Martin. "How?" asked Ted, his eyes wide open in wonder. "By going there to see what it is. I'm going to take you 2 Curly Tops to camp on Star Island, and if there's anything queer there, we'll see what it is." "Oh, are we really going to live on Star Island?" gasped Janet. "Camping out with Grandpa." "Oh, what fun," cried Ted. "Do you mean it?" And he looked anxiously at the farmer, fearing there might be some joke about it. "Oh, I really mean it," said Grandpa Martin. "Though I hardly believe you saw a real light on the island. It must have been a firefly." "Lightning bugs aren't that color," declared Ted. "It was a blue light, almost like 4th of July. But tell us about camping, Grandpa." "Yes, please do," begged January. And while the children are eating their late supper and Grandpa Martin is telling them his plans, I will stop just a little while to make my new readers better acquainted with the Curly Tops and their friends. You have already met Theodore, or Teddy, or Ted Martin, and his sister Janet, or January. With their mother, they were spending the long summer vacation on Cherry Farm, the country home of Grandpa Martin outside the town of Elmberg, near Clover Lake. Mr. Richard Martin, or Dick as Grandpa Martin called him, owned a store in Cresco where he lived with his family. Besides Ted and Jan, there was baby William, aged about 3 years. He was called Trouble, for the reason I have told you, though Mother Martin called him Dear Trouble to make up for the fun Ted and Jan sometimes poked at him. Then there was Nora Jones, the maid who helped Mrs. Martin with the cooking and housework. And I must not forget Skyrocket, a dog, nor Turnover, a cat. These did not help with the housework, though I suppose you might say they did, too, in a way, for they ate the scraps from the table and this helped to save work. In the first book of this series, called The Curly Tops at Cherry Farm, I had the pleasure of telling you how Jan and Ted, with their father, Mother and Nora went to Grandpa's place in the country to spend the happy vacation days. On the farm, which was named after the number of cherry trees on it, the Curly Tops found a stray goat which they were allowed to keep, and they got a wagon which Knick-Knack, the name they gave their new pet, drew with them in it. Having the goat made up for having to leave the dog and the cat at home, and Knick-Knack made lots of good times for Ted and Jan. In the book you may read of the worry the children carried because Grandpa Martin had lost money on account of a flood at his farm, and so could not help when there was a fair and collection for the crippled children's home. But most unexpectedly, the cherries helped when Mr. Sam Sander, the Lollipop Man, bought them from Grandpa Martin and found a way of making them into candy. And when Ted and Jan and Trouble were lost in the woods once, the Lollipop Man, but I think you would rather read the story for yourself in the other book. I will just say that the Curly Tops were still at Cherry Farm, though Father Martin had gone away for a little while. And now, having told you about the family, I'll go back where I left off, and we'll see what is happening. "Yes," said Grandpa Martin. "I think I will take you Curly Tops to camp on Star Island. Camping will do you good. You'll learn lots in the woods there. And won't it be fun to live in a tent?" "Oh, won't it though?" cried Ted. And the shine in Jan's eyes and the glow on her red cheeks showed how happy she was. "But I'd like to know what that blue light was," said the little girl. "Oh, don't worry about that," laughed Grandpa Martin. "I'll get that blue light and hang it in our tent for a lantern." I think I mentioned that Jan and Ted had such wonderful curling hair that even strangers, seeing them the first time, called them the Curly Tops. And Ted, who was aged 7 years, with his sister just a year younger, their anniversaries coming on exactly the same day, did not in the least mind being called this. He and Jan rather liked it. "Let's don't go to bed yet," said Jan to her brother, as they finished supper and went from the dining room into the sitting room, where they were allowed to play and have good times if they did not get too rough. And they did not often do this. All right. It is early, Ted agreed. But what can we do? Let's pretend we have a camp here, went on January. Where? Asked Ted. Right in the sitting room, answered January. We can make believe the couch is a tent, and we can crawl under it and go to sleep. I wants to go to sleeps there, cried Trouble. I wants to go to sleeps right now. Shall we take him back to Mother? Asked Ted, looking at his sister. If he's sleepy now, he won't want to play. I isn't too sleepy to play, objected Baby William. I can go to sleeps under couch if he wants me to, he added. Oh, that'll be real cute, cried Janet. Come on, Ted, let's do it. We can make believe Trouble is our little dog, or something like that, to watch over our tent, and he can go to sleep. Huh. How's he going to watch if he goes to sleep? Ted demanded. Oh, well, he can make believe go to sleep or make believe watch, either one, explained Janet. Yes, I suppose he could do that, agreed Teddy. Baby William opened his mouth wide and yawned. I guess he'll do some real sleeping, said Janet with a laugh. Come on, Trouble. Before you get your eyes so tight shut you can't open them again. Come on, we'll play camping, and she led the way into the sitting room and over toward the big couch at one end. Many a good time the children had had in this room and the old couch. Pretty well battered and broken now, had been in turn a fort, a steamboat, railroad car, and an automobile. That was according to the particular make-believe game the children were playing. Now the old couch was to be a tent, and Jan and Ted moved some chairs, which would be part of the pretend camp up in front of it. It'll be a lot of fun when we go camping for real, said Teddy, as he helped his sister spread one of Grandma Martin's old shawls over the backs of some chairs. This was to be a sort of second tent where they could make believe cook their meals. Yes, we'll have grand fun, agreed January. No, you mustn't go to sleep up there, Trouble, she called to the little fellow. For he had crawled up on top of the couch and had stretched himself out as though to take a nap. Why, he asked, 'cause the tent part is under it, explained his sister. That's the top of the tent where you are. You can't go to sleep on top of a tent. You might fall off. I can fall off now, announced Trouble, as he suddenly thought of something. Then he gave a wiggle and rolled off the seat, bumping into Ted, who had stooped down to put a rug under the couch tent. Ouch! Cried Ted. Look out what you're doing, Trouble. You bumped my head. I bumped my head, exclaimed the little fellow, rubbing his tangled hair. He didn't mean to, said Janet. You mustn't roll off that way, Trouble. You might be hurt. Come now. Go to sleep under the couch. That's inside the tent, you know. She showed him where Ted had spread the rug, as far back under the couch as he could reach. And this looked to Trouble like a nice place. I go to sleeps in there, he said, and under the couch he crawled, growling and grunting. What are you doing that for? Asked Ted, in some surprise. I's a bear, exclaimed Baby William. I's a bad bear. Brrrr, and he growled again. Oh, you mustn't do that, objected Janet. We don't want any bears in our camp. Course we can have, cried Ted. That'll be fun. We'll play Trouble is a bear instead of a dog, and I can hunt him. Only I ought to have something for a gun. I know. I'll get Grandpa's Sunday cane, and he started for the hall. Oh no. I don't want to play bear and hunting, objected Janet. Why not? 'Cause it's too scary at night. Let's play something nice and quiet. Let Trouble be our watchdog. And we can be in camp and he can bark and scare something. What'll he scare? Asked Ted. Meanwhile, baby William was crawling as far back under the couch as he could, growling away. Though whether he was pretending to be a bear, a lion, or only a dog, no one knew but himself. What do you want him to scare? Asked Ted of his sister. Oh, well, chickens, maybe, she answered. Pooh, chickens aren't any fun, cried Ted. If Trouble is going to be a dog, let him scare a wild bull or something like that. Anyhow, chickens don't come to camp. Well, neither does wild bulls, declared Janet. Yes, they do, cried Ted, and it seemed as if there would be so much talk that the children would never get to playing anything. Don't you? 'Member how Daddy told us about going camping, and in the night a wild bull almost knocked down the tent? Well, that was real, but this is only make-believe, said Janet. Let Trouble scare the chickens. All right, agreed Ted, who was nearly always kind to his sister. Go on and growl, Trouble. You're a dog, and you're going to scare the chickens out of camp. They waited a minute, but Trouble did not growl. Why don't you make a noise? Asked Janet. Trouble gave a grunt. What's the matter? Asked Ted. I can't growl, 'cause I'm all stuck under here, answered the voice of the little fellow from far under the couch. I can't wiggle. Oh, dear, cried Janet. Teddy stooped and looked beneath the couch. He's caught on some of the springs that stick down, he said. I'll poke him out. He caught hold of Trouble's clothes and pulled the little fellow loose. But Trouble cried perhaps because he was sleepy, and then his mother came and got him, leaving Teddy and Janet to play by themselves, which they did until they, too, began to feel sleepy. You'll want to go to bed earlier than this when you go camping, my curly tops, said Grandpa Martin, as the children came out of the sitting room. Are you really going to take them camping? Asked Mother Martin after Jan and Ted had gone upstairs to bed. I really am. There are some tents in the barn. I own part of Star Island, and there's no nicer place to camp. You'll come, too. And so will Dick when he comes back from Cresco. We'll take Nora along to do the cooking. Will you come, Mother? And the Curlitop's grandfather looked at his gray-haired wife. No. I'll stay on Cherry Farm and feed the hired men, she answered with a smile. Why do they call it Star Island? Asked Ted's mother. Well, once upon a time, a good many years ago, said Grandpa Martin, a shooting star or meteor fell blazing on the island, and that's how it got its name. Maybe it was a part of the star shining that the children saw tonight, said Grandma Martin. Though I don't see how it could be, for it fell many years ago. Maybe, agreed her husband. None of them knew what a queer part that fallen star was to have in the lives of those who were shortly to go camping on the island. Early the next morning after breakfast, Ted and Jan went out to the barn to get Knick-Knack to have a ride. Where's you? I wants to come, too, cried the voice of their little brother as they were putting the harness on their goat. Oh! There's trouble, whispered Ted. Shall we take him with us, Jan? Yes, this time. We're not going far. Grandma wants us to go to the store for some baking soda. All right, we'll drive down, returned Ted. Come on, Trouble, he called. I's tummin', answered baby William. I's dot a tookie. He means cookie, said Jan, laughing. I know it, agreed Ted. I wish he'd bring me one. Me too, exclaimed Janet. A OT of Tookies went on Trouble, who did not always talk in such baby fashion. When he tried to, he could speak very well, but he did not often try. "Oh, he's got his whole apron full of cookies," cried January. "Where did you get them?" she asked as her little brother came into the barn. "Grandma given 'em to me, and she said you was to have some," announced the little boy as he let the cookies slide out of his apron to a box that stood near the goat wagon. Then baby William began eating a cookie, and Jan and Ted did also, for they, too, were hungry, though it was not long after breakfast. "Goin' to Wide?" asked Trouble, his mouth full of cookie. "Yes, we're going for a ride," answered January. "Oh, Ted, get a blanket or something to put over our laps. It's awful dusty on the road today, even if it did rain last night. It all dried up, I guess." "All right, I'll get a blanket from Grandpa's carriage. And you'd better get a cushion for Trouble." "I will," said Janet, and her brother and sister left baby William alone with the goat for a minute or two. When Jan came back with the cushion, she went to get another cookie, but there were none. "Why, Trouble Martin," she cried, "did you eat them all?" "All what?" "All the cookies. I did eat one, and Knick-Knack he did eat the west. He was hungry, he was, and he did eat the west ob. I feeded to him." "Knick-Knack was a hungry goat," said Trouble, smiling. "I should think he was hungry to eat up all those cookies." "I only had one," cried January. "What? Did Knick-Knack get at the cookies?" cried Ted, coming back with a light lap robe. "Trouble gave them to him," explained Janet. "Oh dear, I was so hungry for another." "I'll ask Grandma for some," promised Ted, and he soon came back with his hands full of the round, brown molasses cookies. "Hello, Curly Tops. What can I do for you today?" asked the storekeeper a little later when the three children had driven up to his front door. "Do you want a barrel of sugar put in your wagon or a keg of salt mackerel?" "I have both." "We want baking soda," answered January. "And you shall have the best I've got." "Where are you going off to look for the end of the rainbow and get the pot of gold at the end?" he asked jokingly. "No, we're not going far today," answered Ted. "Well, stop in when you're passing this way again," called out the storekeeper as Ted turned Knick-Knack around for the homeward trip. "I'm always glad to see you." "Maybe you won't see us now for quite a while," answered Jan proudly. "No? Why not? You're not going to leave Cherry Farm, I hope." Ted stopped Knick-Knack that they might better explain. "We're going camping with Grandpa on Star Island." "Where's that you're going?" asked a farmer who had just come out of the store after buying some groceries. "Camping on Star Island in Clover Lake," repeated Ted. "Huh, I wouldn't go there if I were you," said the farmer, shaking his head. "Why not?" asked Ted. "Is it because of the blue light?" And he looked at his sister to see if she remembered. "I don't know anything about a blue light," the farmer answered. "But if I were your grandfather, I wouldn't take you there camping." And the man again shook his head. "Why not?" asked Janet, her eyes opening wide in surprise. "Well, I'll tell you why," went on the farmer. "I was over on Star Island fishing the other day, and I saw a couple of tramps or maybe gypsies there. I didn't like the looks of the men, and that's why I wouldn't go there camping if I were you or your grandpa." And the farmer shook his head again as he unhitched his team of horses. Chapter 3 Off to Star Island. "Oh, Ted," exclaimed Janet, as she drove home in the goat wagon with her brother and baby William. Do you suppose we can't go camping with Grandpa? Why can't we? Demanded Teddy. 'Cause of what that farmer said. Oh, well. I guess Grandpa won't be afraid of tramps on the island. It's part his, anyhow, and he can make Em get off. Yes, he could do that, agreed Janet after thinking the matter over. But if they were gypsies? Well, gypsies and tramps are the same. Grandpa can make the gypsies get off the island too. They might take trouble, faltered Jan in a low voice. Who? Asked Ted. The gypsies. Who take me? Demanded Trouble himself. Who take me, Jam? Sometimes he called his sister Jam instead of January. Who take me? He asked, playfully poking his fingers in his sister's eyes. Oh, nobody, she answered quickly as she took him off her lap and put him behind her in the cart. She did not want to frighten her little brother. Let's hurry home and tell Grandpa, Jan said to Ted, and he nodded his curly head to show that he would do that. On trotted Knick-Knack. Trouble being now seated in the back of the wagon on a cushion, while Ted and Jan were in front. Maybe it was tramps making a campfire that we saw last night, went on Jan after a pause, during which they came nearer to Cherry Farm. A campfire blaze isn't blue, declared Ted. Well, maybe this is a new kind. Ted shook his head until his curls waggled. I don't believe so, he said. Bang. There, me shoot you, suddenly cried Trouble, and Ted and Jan heard something fall with a thud on the ground behind them. Whoa, there, cried Ted to Knick-Knack. What are you shooting? Trouble, baby? He asked, turning to look at his little brother. Me shoot a bunny rabbit, was the answer. Oh, there's a little bunny, cried Jan, pointing to a small, brown one that ran along under the bushes and then came to a stop in front of the goat wagon, pausing to look at the children. Me shoot him, said Trouble, laughing gleefully. What with? Asked Ted, a sudden thought coming into his mind. Trouble froze store thing at bunny, said the little boy. It woken. All white stuff comment out. Oh, Trouble. Did you throw Grandma's soda at the bunny? Cried January. Yes, I did, answered baby William. And it's all busted, exclaimed Ted, as he saw the white powder scattered about on the woodland path. We've got to go back to the store for some more. Oh, Trouble Martin. Eyes didn't hurt de bunny wabbit, said Trouble earnestly. Eyes only make beeve shoot him bang. I know you didn't hurt the bunny, observed January. But you've hurt Grandma's soda. Is there any left, Ted? She asked as her brother got out of the wagon to pick up the broken package. A little, he answered. There's some in the bottom. I guess we'll go back to the store and get more. I want to ask that farmer again about the tramps on Star Island. No, don't, begged January. Let's take what soda we have to Grandma. Maybe it'll be enough. Anyhow, if we did go back for more, Trouble might throw that out, too, if he saw a rabbit. That's so. I guess we'd better leave him when we go to the store next time. How'd he get the soda, anyhow? It must have jiggled out of my lap, where I was holding it, and then it fell in the bottom of the wagon and he got it. He didn't know any better. No, I suppose not. Well, maybe Grandma can use this. Teddy carefully lifted up the broken package of baking soda, more than half of which had spilled when Trouble threw it at the little brown rabbit. Baby William may have thought the package of soda was a white stone, for it was wrapped in a white paper. Well, I'm glad he didn't hit the little bunny anyhow, said January. Where is it? and she looked for the rabbit. But the timid woodland creature had hopped away, probably to go to its burrow and tell a wonderful story in rabbit language about having seen some giants in a big wagon drawn by an elephant, for to a rabbit a goat must seem as large as a circus animal. I guess Trouble can't hit much that he throws at, observed Ted, as he started knick-knack once more toward Cherry Farm. He threw a hairbrush at me once and hit me, declared January. Yes, I remember, said Teddy. Here, Trouble. If you want to throw things, throw these, and he stopped to pick up some old acorns which he gave his little brother. You can't hurt anyone with them. Trouble was delighted with his new playthings and kept quiet the rest of the way home, tossing the acorns out of the goat wagon at the trees he passed. Grandma Martin said it did not matter about the broken box of soda, as there was enough left for her need, so Ted and Jan did not have to go back to the store. But I'd like to ask that farmer more about the tramps on Star Island, said Ted to his grandfather, when telling what the man had said at the grocery. I'll see him and ask him, decided Grandpa Martin. It was 2 days after this 2 days during which the Curly Tops had much fun at Cherry Farm that Grandpa Martin spoke at dinner one afternoon. I saw Mr. Crittenden, he said, and he told me that he had seen you Curly Tops at the store and mentioned the tramps on Star Island. Are they really there? Asked Jan eagerly. Well, they might have been, but we won't let them bother us if we go camping. I'll make them clear out. Most of that island belongs to me and the rest to friends of mine. They'll do as I say. And we'll clear out the tramps. I hope you will, Grandpa, said Janet. Did Mr. Crittenden say anything about the queer blue light Jan and Ted saw? Asked Grandma Martin. No, he hadn't seen that. Where did the tramps come from? And is he sure they weren't gypsies? Asked Jan's mother. No, they weren't gypsies. We don't often see them around here. Oh! I imagine the tramps were the regular kind that go about the country in summer, begging their way. They might have found a boat and gone to the island to sleep, where no constable would trouble them. But we're not afraid of tramps, are we, Curly Tops? He cried, as he caught baby William up in his arms and set him on his broad shoulder. We don't mind them. Do we, Trouble? We throw water on 'em, said baby William, laughing with delight as his grandfather made believe bite some souse off his ears. That's what we will. No tramps for us on Star Island. When are we going? Asked Ted excitedly. Yes, when? Echoed January. In a few days now. I've got to get out the tents and other things. We'll go the first of the week, I think. Ted and Jan could hardly wait for the time to come. They helped as much as they could when Grandpa Martin got the tents out of the barn, and they wanted to take so many of their toys and playthings along that there would have been no room in the boat for anything else if they had had their way. But Mother Martin thinned out their collection of treasures, allowing them to take only what she thought would give them the most pleasure. Boxes of food were packed, and a little stove made ready to take along, for although a campfire looks nice, it is hard to cook over. Trouble got into all sorts of mischief, from almost falling out of the haymow once, to losing the bucket down the well by letting the chain unwind too fast. But a hired man caught him as he toppled off the hay in the barn, and Grandpa Martin got the bucket up from the well by tying the rake to a long pole and fishing deep down in the water. At last the day came when the Curly Tops were to go camping on Star Island. The boat was loaded with the tents and other things, and 2 or 3 trips were to be made halfway across the lake, for the island was about in the middle. Knick-Knack and his wagon were to be taken over and a small stable made for him under a tree not far from the big tent. "All aboard!" cried Ted as he and Jan took their places in the first boat. "All aboard! Isn't this fun?" laughed Janet, who was taking care of Trouble. "Dis fun," echoed the little chap. "I'm sure we'll have a nice time," said Mother Martin. "And your father will like it when he, too, can camp out with us." "I hope the tramps don't bother you," said Mr. Crittenden, who had come to help Grandpa Martin get his camping party ready. "Oh, we're not afraid of them," cried Ted. "Well, be careful, that's all I've got to say," went on the farmer. "I'll let you have my gun, if you think you'll need it," he said to Grandpa Martin. "Nonsense. I won't need it, thank you. I'm not afraid of a few tramps. Besides, I sent one of my men over to the island yesterday, and he couldn't find a sign of a vagrant. If any tramps were there, they've gone. Wall, maybe," said the farmer with a shake of his head. "Good luck to you, anyhow." "Thanks," laughed Grandpa Martin. "All aboard," called Ted once more. Then Sam, the hired man, and Grandpa Martin began to row the boat. The Curlytops were off for Star Island to camp out with Grandpa. Chapter 4 Overboard, Trouble. "Sit still," ordered Janet. "Yes, Trouble." "You sit still," called Mother Martin, as the Curlytop's grandfather and his man pulled on the oars that sent the boat out toward the middle of the lake. "Don't move about. I wants to splash water." "Oh, no, you mustn't do that. Splashing water isn't nice," said Baby William's mother. "Ike Grandpa does," Trouble went on, pointing to the oars which the farmer was moving to and fro. Now and then a little wave hit the broad blades and splashed little drops into the boat. "Trouble won't do that," declared the little fellow. "No, Trouble mustn't do that," said his mother. "Grandpa isn't splashing the water. He's rowing. Sit still and watch him." Baby William did sit still for a little while, but not for very long. His mother held to the loose part of his blue and white romper so he would not get far away, but after a bit, she rather forgot about him in talking to Ted and Jan about what they were to do and not to do in camp. Suddenly Grandpa, who had been rowing slowly towards Star Island, dropped his oars and cried, "Look out there." "Trouble." "Oh, what's the matter?" asked Mother Martin, looking around quickly. "Trouble nearly jumped out of the boat," explained Grandpa Martin. "I just grabbed him in time." And so he had, catching Baby William by the seat of his rompers and pulling him back on the seat from which he had quickly sprung up. "What were you trying to do?" asked Mrs. Martin. "Trouble want to catch fish," was the little fellow's answer. "Yes, I guess a fish would catch you first," laughed Ted. "I'll sit by him and hold him in," offered Janet. And she remained close to her small brother during the remainder of the trip across the lake. He did not again try to lean far over as he had done when his grandfather saw him and grabbed him. "Hooray!" cried Teddy as he sprang ashore. "Now for the camp. Can I help put up the tents, Grandpa?" "Yes, when it's time. But first we must bring the rest of the things over. We'll finish that first and put up the tents afterward. We have 2 more boatloads to bring." "Then can I help do that?" "Yes." "You may do that," said Grandpa Martin with a smile. "Can I come, too?" asked Janet. "I'm almost as strong as Teddy." "I think you'd better stay and help me look after Trouble," said Mrs. Martin. Nora will be busy getting lunch ready for us, which we will eat before the tents are up." "Oh, then I can help at that," cried Janet, who was eager to be busy. "Come on, Nora. Where are the things to eat?" "Mother? I'm hungry already." "So am I," cried Ted. "Can't we eat before we go back for the other boatload, Grandpa?" "Yes, I guess so. You curly tops can eat while Sam and I unload the boat. I'll call you Teddy when I'm ready to go back." "All right, Grandpa." The tents were to be put up and camp made a little way up from the shore near the spot at which they had landed. Grandpa Martin took out of the boat the different things he had brought over and stacked them up on shore. Parts of the tents were there, and things to cook with as well as food to eat. More things would be brought on the next 2 trips, when another of the hired men was to come over to help put up the tents and make camp. "Oh, I just know we'll have fun here." "Camping with Grandpa," laughed Jan, as she picked up her small brother who had slipped and fallen down a little hill, covered with brown pine needles. "Let's go and look for something," proposed Ted, when he had run about a bit and thrown stones in the lake, watching the water splash up and hundreds of rings chase each other toward shore. "What'll we look for?" asked Janet, as she took hold of Trouble's hand so he would not slip down again. "Oh, anything we can find," went on Ted. "We'll have some fun while we're waiting for Grandpa to get out the things to eat." "I want something to eat," cried Trouble. "I's hungry." "So am I a little bit," admitted January. "Maybe we could find a cookie or something before they get everything unpacked," suggested Teddy. And this was just what happened. Grandpa Martin had some cookies in a paper bag in his pocket. Grandma Martin had put them there, for she felt sure the children would get hungry before their regular lunch was ready on the island. And she knew how hungry it makes anyone, children especially, to start off on a picnic in the woods or across a lake. "There you are, curly tops," laughed Grandpa Martin as he passed out the molasses and sugar cookies. "Now don't drop any of them on your toes." "Why not?" Ted wanted to know. "Oh, because it might break them. I mean, it might break your cookies," and Grandpa Martin laughed again. "Come now, we'll go and look for things," proposed Ted as he took a bite of his cookie, something which Jan and Trouble were also doing. "What'll we look for?" Jan asked again. "Oh, maybe we can find a cave or a den where a fox lives," he said, rather stumbling over his words. At first Ted had been going to say that perhaps they would look for a bear's den, but then he happened to remember that even talk of a bear, though of course there were none on Star Island, might scare his little brother and January. So he said fox instead. "Is there a fox here?" Jan asked. "Maybe," said Ted. "Anyhow, let's go off and look." "Don't go too far," called Grandpa Martin after them as he started to unload the boat and get the camp in order. "And don't go too near the edge of the lake. I don't want you to fall in and have your mother blame me." "No, we won't," promised Ted. "Come on," he called to his little brother and sister. "Oh, there you go again," he cried as he saw Trouble stumble and fall. "What's the matter?" he asked. "It's these pine needles. They're awfully slippery," answered Janet. "I nearly slipped down myself." "Did you hurt yourself, Trouble?" she asked the little fellow. He did not answer directly, but first looked at the place where he had fallen. He could easily see it, because the pine needles were brushed to one side. Then baby William tried to turn around and look at the back of his little bloomers. "No, I isn't hurted," he said. Janet and Ted laughed. I guess maybe he thought he might have broken his leg or something, remarked Teddy. Now come on and don't fall any more, Trouble. But the little fellow was not quite ready to go on. He stooped over and looked at the ground where he had fallen. What's the matter? Asked Janet, who was waiting to lead him on, holding his hand so he would not fall. Maybe he lost something, said Teddy. Has he got any pockets in his bloomers, Jan? No, Mother sewed M up so he wouldn't put his hands in M all the while, and his hands were so dirty they made his bloomers the same way. He hasn't any pockets. Then he couldn't lose anything, decided Ted. He was always losing things from his pockets, so perhaps he ought to know about what he was talking. What is it, Trouble? He asked, for the little fellow was still stooping over and looking carefully at the ground near the spot where he had fallen. I sat it right down on him, said Trouble at last, as he picked up something from the earth. I sat it right down on him, but I didn't bust him, and he held out something on a little piece of wood. What's he got? Asked Ted. Oh, it's only an ant, answered Janet. I guess he saw a little ant crawling along just before he fell, and he sat down on him. Did you think you'd hurt the little ant, Trouble? I sat it on him, but I didn't hurt him, answered the little boy. He can wiggle along nicey, and he showed the ant, crawling about on the piece of wood. Perhaps the little ant wondered how in the world it was ever going to get back to the ground again. Put him down and come on, said Ted. We want to find something before Grandpa puts up the tent. Maybe we can find the den where the fox lives. Trouble carefully put the little ant back on the ground. I sat it on him, but I didn't hurt it him, again said the little fellow, grunting as he stood up straight again. Janet took his hand, and they followed Teddy off through the forest. It was very pleasant in the woods on Star Island. The sun was shining brightly, and the waters of the lake sparkled in the sun. The children felt glad and happy that they had come camping with their grandpa, and they knew that the best fun was yet to happen. Let's look around for holes now, said Teddy, after they had gone a little way down a woodland path. What sort of holes? Asked Janet. Holes where a fox lives, answered her brother. If we could find a fox, maybe we could tame it. Wouldn't it bite? The little girl asked. Well, maybe a little bit at first, but not after it got tame, said Teddy. Come on. They walked a little way farther, and then Jan suddenly cried, Oh, I see a hole. She pointed to one beneath the roots of a big tree. That's a fox den, I guess, exclaimed Teddy. We'll watch and see what comes out. The children hid in the bushes where they could look at the hole in the ground. For some time they waited, and then they began to get tired. The curly tops were not used to keeping still. I'm going to sneeze, said Trouble suddenly, and sneeze he did. And just then a little brown animal bounced out from under a bush and ran into the hole. Oh, it's a bunny rabbit, cried Janet. He lives in that hole. Come on, Ted, let's walk. We've found out what it was. It isn't a fox, it's a bunny. Let's go and find something else on the island. Maybe we can find a big cave. And maybe we'll find out what that blue light was, cried Ted eagerly. I guess I don't want to look for that, remarked Jan slowly. Why not? 'Cause don't you? 'Member what Hal said about there bein' ghosts on this island? And Janet looked over her shoulder, though it was broad daylight. Pooh, laughed her brother. I thought you didn't believe in ghosts. I don't, but I'm not afraid, declared Teddy. and I'm going to look and see if I can't find the lost star that fell on the island. Grandpa said it all burned up. Well, maybe a little piece of it was left. Anyhow, I'm going to look. So they looked, but they found nothing like the blue light, and then Ted said he was hungry and wanted to eat. Nora and Mrs. Martin had set out a little lunch for the children on top of a packing box, and the Curly Tops and Trouble were soon enjoying the sandwiches and cake, while their grandfather and the hired man finished unloading the boat. In a little while, Grandpa Martin called, "All aboard. Teddy, if you're going back with me." "I'm coming," was the answer. "I'm coming." It did not take Grandpa Martin long to pull back to the mainland in the boat, which was empty save for himself and Ted. The lake was smooth, a little wind making tiny waves that gently lapped the side of the boat. "I think we'd better bring Knick-Knack over this trip," said Grandpa Martin, when a second farmhand met him on shore and began to help load the boat for the second trip. "The sooner we get that goat over on the island, the better I'll feel." "Why, you're not afraid of him, are you?" asked the hired man, whose name was George. "No, but I don't know how easy it's going to be to ferry him over. He may start some of his tricks, so we won't put much in the boat this time. We'll leave plenty of room for the goat and the cart." "Oh, Knick-Knack will be good," declared Ted. "I know he will. Won't you, Knick-Knack?" And he put his arms around his pet. The goat had been driven down near the dock whence the boat started for Star Island. "Well, unharness him and we'll get him on board," said the farmer. "Then we'll see what happens next." Knick-Knack made no fuss at all about being unharnessed. His wagon was first wheeled on the boat, which was a large one and broad. Then Ted started Knick-Knack toward the craft. "Gadap!" cried Teddy to Knick-Knack. "We're going to camp on Star Island, and you can have lots of fun. Gadap!" Knick-Knack stood still on the dock for a few seconds, and he seemed to be sniffing the boat and the water in which it floated. Then, with a little wiggle of his funny, short tail, he jumped down in near his wagon and began eating some grass which Ted had pulled and placed there for him. "It's a sort of bait, like a piece of cheese in a mousetrap," remarked Ted as he saw the goat nibbling. "Isn't he good, Grandpa?" "He's good now, Teddy, but whether he'll be good all the way over is something I can't say." "I hope so." George put in the boat as much as could safely be carried, with the goat as a passenger. And then he and Grandpa Martin began rowing towards Star Island. At first, everything went very well. Knick-Knack seemed a little frightened when the boat tipped and rocked, but Ted patted him and fed him more grass, which Knick-Knack liked very much. "I knew he'd be good," Teddy said when they were almost at the island and could see Jan waving to them. "I knew he'd like the boat ride, Grandpa." "Yes, he seems to like it. Now but just then something happened. The wind suddenly blew rather hard, roughening the water and causing the boat to tip. Knick-Knack was jostled over against the wagon, and some water splashed on him. "Bye," bleated the goat. Then, before anyone could stop him, he gave a leap over Teddy's head, and into the water splashed Knick-Knack. The goat had leaped overboard into the deepest part of Clover Lake. Chapter 5: The Bag of Salt. Oh, cried Teddy. "Oh, there goes my nice goat. Catch him, Grandpa. Stop him." Grandpa Martin stopped rowing and looked in surprise at the goat. So did the hired man. "Well, just look," exclaimed George. "Oh, he'll be drowned." "He'll be drowned," wailed Teddy, tears coming into his eyes, for he loved Knick-Knack. "He'll be drowned." Grandpa Martin rested his hands on the oars and looked into the water. Then he smiled. "I guess you'd have hard work drowning that goat," he said. "He's swimming like a fish." "And right straight for Star Island," added the hired man. "That's a smart goat, all right. He knows where he wants to go and the shortest way to get there." Surely enough, Knick-Knack was swimming toward the island. When he jumped out of the boat, he floundered a little in the water and splashed some on Teddy. Then he struck out, paddling as a dog does with his front feet. Knick-Knack turned himself about until he was headed toward the island, and then he swam straight toward it. "Oh, won't he drown?" Grandpa asked Teddy. "I don't believe so, my boy. I guess Knick-Knack knows more than we thought he did. Maybe he didn't like the way we rode, or he may have wanted a bath. Anyhow, he jumped overboard. But he'll be all right. See him go," cried the hard man. Knick-Knack was swimming quite fast. Of course, a goat is not as good a swimmer as is a duck or a fish, but Ted's pet did very well. On shore were Nora, Mrs. Martin, Janet, Trouble, and the farm hand who had gone over in the first boatload. They were watching the goat swimming toward them. "Did you throw him into the water?" Teddy asked Janet as soon as the boat was near enough so that talking could be heard. "He jumped in," Ted answered. "Isn't he a good swimmer?" "I should say so. Here, Knick-Knack. Come here," Janet called. The goat, which had been headed toward a spot a little way down the island from where Janet and her mother stood, turned at the sound of the little girl's voice and came in her direction. "Oh, he knows me," she cried in delight. "Now don't shake yourself the way Skyrocket does and get me all wet," she begged, as Knick-Knack scrambled out on shore, water dripping from his hairy coat. But the goat did not act like a dog who gives himself a great shaking whenever he comes on shore after having been in the water. Knick-Knack just let it drip off him and began to nibble some of the grass that grew on the island. He was making himself perfectly at home, it seemed. The goat wagon and the other things were soon landed. And then Grandpa Martin and one of the hired men went back for the last load. When that came back and the things were piled up near the tents, the work of setting up the camp went on. There was much yet to be done. Ted and Jan helped all they could in putting up the tents. So did Mother Martin and Nora, who was large and strong. She could pull on a rope about as well as a man. And there were many ropes that needed tightening and fastening around pegs driven into the ground so the tents would not blow over in the wind. Knick-Knack had been tied to a tree, near which, a little later, Ted and Jan were going to make him a little bower of leaves and branches. That was to be a stable until a better one could be built by Grandpa Martin, one that would keep Knick-Knack dry when it rained. At last the tents were up, one for sleeping, another for cooking, and a third where the curly tops and the others would eat their meals. It was a fine camp that Grandpa Martin made, and he knew just how to do it right. Even to digging little trenches or ditches around the tents so the water would run off when it stormed. "And now let's take a walk and see what we can find," suggested Ted to Janet. When Mother Martin said they might play about until supper was ready, for they had called the lunch they had eaten their dinner. "Don't go too far," cautioned Mother Martin. "Oh, we can't get lost on this island," said Ted. "All we'd have to do, if we were, would be to walk along the shore until we came to this camp." "I know that. But it wasn't so much about your getting lost that I was thinking," said Mrs. Martin. Oh, you mean the tramps? Half-whispered Janet. Well, I don't know whether there are any here or not, went on her mother. But it's best to be careful until Grandpa has had a chance to look about. Where's Grandpa now? He's getting some water at the spring, Ted answered. There was a fine spring on Star Island, not far from the place where the tents had been set up. And Mr. Martin was now bringing pails of water from that and pouring them into a barrel which would hold so much that even Trouble would have plenty to drink no matter how thirsty he was. Well, don't go too far away until either Grandpa or I have a chance to go with you, added Mrs. Martin. Me come, too, called Trouble, as he saw his brother and sister starting off. Oh, Mother, exclaimed Teddy. No, you stay with Mother, said Mrs. Martin. I'll give you a nice drink of milk. Don't want milk. I's had milk. Trouble want Ted in January. But you can't go with them, my dear. Come on. We'll go and throw stones into the lake and make believe it's a great, big ocean. Baby William pouted a little at first. He liked to have his own way. But when he saw what fun his mother was having tossing stones into the lake and making the water splash up, Trouble did the same, laughing at the fun he was having. "Dissa ocean, Momsey?" he asked as he set a little stick afloat, making believe it was a boat. Well, we'll call it an ocean, Mrs. Martin answered. But this water is fresh, and that in the ocean is very salty. Someday I'll take you and my two little curly tops to the real ocean, and you can taste how salty the waves are. Now we'll throw some more stones. Meanwhile, Ted and Jan started for a little walk down the path that went the whole length of Star Island. Shall we take Knick-Knack? Asked January. No, let's wait until he dries off after his bath, decided Teddy. I don't like wet goats. Why, Teddy Martin, Knick-Knack got dried out hours ago. Well, anyway, a goat isn't like a dog. We don't want a goat along when we are going out walking. So Knick-Knack was left to nibble the grass, while the curly tops wandered on and on. Grandpa and the hired men, having finished putting up the tents, were getting the stove ready so Nora could get supper. What are you looking for? Asked Jan when she noticed that her brother walked along as if searching for something. Are you trying to see if any tramps or gypsies are here on the island? No. I was thinking maybe I could find that fallen star. But didn't Grandpa say it all melted up? Maybe a piece of it's left, went on Ted. This was the second time that he had spoken of the star that day. If I can't find a chunk of it, maybe I can find the hole it made when it hit, he added. I'd like to find that. Maybe it would be bigger than the one I dug when I thought I could go all the way through to China. Yes, the time Skyrocket fell in, laughed January. Remember that, Teddy? I guess I do. Daddy had to go out in the night and bring him in. Come on, let's look for the hole the shooting star made. All right. The two curly tops walked on over the island, looking here and there for star holes. They found a number of deep places, but after looking at them and poking sticks down into them, Ted decided that none of them had ever held a shooting star. Maybe bears made them, half-whispered January. There aren't any bears on this island, Teddy declared. I hope not, murmured his sister, as she looked over her shoulder and then kept close to her brother during the rest of the walk. Pretty soon the children heard their mother's voice calling them. They could hear very plainly, for the air was clear. I guess supper is ready, said Janet. I hope it is, sighed Ted. I'm awful hungry. Supper was ready, smoking hot on the table in the dining tent. when Ted and Jan reached the camp Grandpa had made. "Oh, how good it smells," cried Ted. "And how nice the white tents look under the green trees," added his sister. "I just love it here." "It is the nicest place we have yet been for the summer vacation," said Mother Martin. "This and Cherry Farm are two lovely places." They sat down under the tent and began to eat. Nora had gotten up a fine supper, for a regular cook stove had been brought along, and it was almost like eating at Grandma Martin's table, only this was out of doors. For the sides of the tent were raised to let in the air and the rays of the setting sun. "What's the matter, Father?" asked Mrs. Martin. As she saw the children's grandfather pause after tasting the potatoes. "Is anything wrong?" "I think I'd like a little more salt on these." "Yes, they do need salting." "Nora, bring the salt, please." "There isn't any, except what I used when I was cooking a little I had in a salt shaker." "Oh, yes, there must be. I brought a whole bag full. I saw it when I unpacked some of the things. There was a sack of salt." "Well, it isn't here now," said Nora as she looked among her kitchen things. "Has anyone seen the bag of salt?" asked Mrs. Martin. She looked at Ted and Jan, who shook their heads. Then Trouble's mother looked at him. He was busy with a piece of bread and jam. One could have told Trouble had been eating bread and jam just by looking at his mouth and face. "Did you see the salt, Trouble?" asked his mother. "ISS, I did," he answered, taking another bite. "Where is it?" "Into water," he replied. "I puts it into water." "You put the salt in the water? What water?" "Tell Mother, Trouble." "I put salt into lake water to make him Ike Ocean." "Trouble, Ike Ocean." "Come on, I show." And, getting down out of his chair, he toddled toward a little cove near the camp. The others, following him, saw something white on the ground near the edge of the lake. Grandpa Martin touched it with his finger and tasted. "The little tyke did empty the whole bag of salt in the lake," cried the farmer. "Fancy his trying to make it like the ocean." "Ho! Ho! Oh!" "Trouble," cried Mrs. Martin. "You wasted a whole bag of salt, and now Grandpa hasn't any for his potatoes." Chapter 6. Ted and the bear baby William looked a little bit frightened and ashamed as his mother spoke to him in that way. He loved his grandfather, and of course he would not have done anything to make him feel bad if he had thought. But Trouble was a very little fellow, though his father often said he could get into as many kinds of mischief as could the larger curly tops. "Oh dear, this is too bad," went on Mrs. Martin. "Why did you do it, Trouble? What made you empty the bag of salt into the lake?" "Want to make ocean with salt water," was the answer. "I suppose it's my fault for telling him so much about the big sea and its salt water," said Trouble's mother. "He liked to hear me talk about the ocean, and I guess he must have been thinking about it more than I had any idea of. He must have tasted the water of the lake and found it wasn't salty, and then he thought that, to make an ocean and big waves out of a lake, all he had to do was to put in the salt." "I'm sorry, Father." "Oh, that's all right," laughed Grandpa Martin. "I guess I can get along without any more salt." "Trouble's sorry, too," said the little fellow, when he understood that he had done something wrong. "Me get salt water for you," and he started toward the place where he had emptied the bag into the water, carrying a spoon from the table. "No, Trouble. Come back," ordered his mother. "I guess he wants to dip up some salt water for you," she said laughingly to the children's grandfather, but he'd be more likely to fall in himself. She caught Trouble up in her arms and kissed him, and then Nora managed to find a little salt in the bottom of the shaker, so Grandpa Martin had some on his potatoes after all. But Trouble was told he must never again do anything like that. He promised, of course, but Jan said he'll do something else just as bad. I guess he will, laughed Teddy. Supper over. Mr. Martin took his 2 men over to the mainland. On his return, they all gathered about a little campfire Grandpa made in front of the sleeping tent. The cot beds had been set up, and a mosquito netting was hung at the front door of the white canvas house, though really there was no door, just 2 flaps of the tent that could be tied together. But the netting kept out the bugs. Fortunately, there were no mosquitoes, though all sorts of moths, snapping bugs, and other flying things came around whenever a lantern was lighted. "Tell us a story, Grandpa," begged Janet, when they had finished talking about the many things that had happened during the first day in camp. "Tell us about the shooting star that fell on this island," begged Teddy. "Tell us about the Twomps," exclaimed Trouble, who ought to have been asleep, but who had begged to stay up a little longer than usual. "I don't know anything about the tramps," laughed Grandpa, "and I don't believe there are any on the island, though it is a large one. And it will take 2 or 3 days for us to walk all about it. As for the shooting star, which Teddy thinks about so much, I really didn't see it fall. And all I know is what the old men in the village have told me. It was many years ago." "And did you ever see the blue light?" asked Ted, thinking of what he and his sister had seen the night they were coming home from the little visit to Halchester. "No, I never did, though I'd like to, so I might know what it was." "Children, how is Grandpa ever going to tell you a story if you keep asking him so many questions?" laughed Mrs. Martin. "All right, now we'll listen," promised Teddy. And Grandpa Martin told a tale of when he was a little boy and lived further to the north and on the edge of a big wood where there were bears and other wild animals. His father was a good hunter, Grandpa Martin said, and often used to kill bears and wolves, for the country was wild, with never so much as one automobile in it. Grandpa finished his story of the olden days by telling of once when he was a small boy coming home through the woods toward dark one evening and being chased by a bear. But he crawled into a hollow log where the bear could not get him, and later his father and some other hunters came, shot the bear, and got the little boy safely out. "Phew," whistled Teddy when this was finished. "I'd like to have been there." "In the log, hiding away from the bear?" asked his mother. "No, I guess not that," Ted answered. "I'd just like to have seen it up in a tree, where the bear couldn't get me." "Bears can climb trees," remarked Janet. "Well, I'd go up in a little tree too small for a bear," her brother answered. "I guess you'd all better go to your little beds," laughed Mother Martin. "It's long past your sleepy time." And the Curly Tops and Trouble were soon sound asleep. It must have been about the middle of the night anyhow. It was quite late when Teddy, who was sleeping in his cot next to one of the side walls of the tent, was suddenly awakened by a noise outside, and something seemed to be trying to get through. "Oh! Oh!" cried Teddy, quickly sitting up in bed and wide awake all at once. "Oh, Mother! Something's after me. It's a bear! It's a bear!" "Hush!" quickly exclaimed Mrs. Martin. "You'll waken William and frighten him." "But Mother, I'm sure it's a bear," he growled. "What is it?" asked Jan. from her cot on the other side of the tent. "It's a bear," cried Ted again. There did seem to be something going on outside the tent near Ted's side. There was a crackling in the bushes, and once something came pushing hard against the side of the white canvas house with force enough to make a bulge in it. Teddy jumped up from his cot and ran over to his mother, who was sitting up on her bed. "Oh, Mother, it's coming in," cried Teddy. "Nonsense," and Mrs. Martin laughed as she put her arms around her small son. "What is it?" asked Grandpa Martin from the curtained-off part of the tent where he slept. "It's a bear," cried Janet. Just then, from outside came a loud "Ba-a-a." Teddy looked very much surprised. Then he smiled. Then he laughed and cried, "Why, it's our goat Knick-Knack." "I guess that's what it is," added Grandpa Martin. "But he seems to be in trouble. I'll go outside and look." Taking a lantern with him, while Mrs. Martin and the children waited a bit anxiously, Grandpa Martin went to see what had happened. The Curlytops heard him laughing as they saw the flicker of his light through the white tent. Then they heard Knick-Knack bleeding again. The goat seemed, to those inside, to be kicking about with his little black hoofs. "Whoa there, Knick-Knack," called Grandpa Martin. "I'll soon get you loose." There was more noise, more tramping in the bushes, and then, after a while, Grandpa Martin came back. "What was it?" asked Ted and Jan in whispers, for their mother had begged them not to awaken Trouble, who was still sleeping peacefully. "It was your goat," was the answer. "He had got loose, and his horns were caught between two trees where he had tried to jump. He was held fast by his horns, and he was kicking his heels up in the air, trying to get loose." "Did you get him out?" asked January. "Yes, I pried the trees apart and got his head loose. Then he was all right. I tied him good and tight in his stable, and I guess he won't bother us again tonight." "Then it wasn't a bear after all," remarked Jan, laughing at her brother. "No, indeed. There aren't any bears on this island," said her grandfather. "Go to sleep." Nothing else happened the rest of the night, and they all slept rather late the next morning, for they were tired from the work of the day before. The sun was shining over Clover Lake when Nora rang the breakfast bell, and Ted and Jan hurried with their dressing, for they were eager to be at their play. "What'll we do today?" asked Janet as she tried to get a comb through her thick, curly hair. "We'll go for a ride with Knick-Knack," decided Ted, who was also having a hard time with his locks. "Oh, I wish I was a barber," he cried as the comb stuck in a bunch of curls. "Why?" asked his mother, who was giving Trouble his breakfast. "'Cause then I'd cut my own hair short, and I'd never have to comb it." "Oh, I wouldn't want to see you without your curls," Mother Martin said. "Here, I'll help you as soon as I feed Trouble." Trouble could feed himself when his plate had been set in front of him, and while he was eating, Mrs. Martin made her two Curlytops look better by the use of their combs. After breakfast, the children ran to hitch Knick-Knack to the wagon. Grandpa Martin was going back in the rowboat to the mainland to get a few things that had been forgotten, and also another bag of salt. "And I'll hide it away from Trouble," said Nora with a laugh. "We don't want any more salty oceans around here. Let's drive away before Trouble sees us," proposed Jan to her brother. "He'll want to come for a ride, and we can't go very far if he comes along." "All right. Stoop down and walk behind the bushes. Then he can't see us." Jan and Ted managed to get away unseen, and were soon hitching their goat to the wagon. Trouble finished his breakfast and called to them, wanting to go with them wherever they went. But his mother knew the two curly tops did not want trouble with them every time, so baby William had to play by himself about camp, while the two older children drove off on a path that led the long way of the island. "Maybe we'll have an adventure," suggested Jan as she sat in the cart driving the goat. For she and her brother took turns at this fun. "Maybe we'll see some of the tramps," he added. "I don't want to," said January. "Well, maybe we'll see a bear." "I don't want that either." "I wish you wouldn't say such things, Teddy." "Well, what do you want to see?" "Oh, something nice, flowers or birds or maybe a fairy." "Huh, I guess there's no fairies on this island either. Let's see if we can find an apple tree." "I'd like an apple." "So would I. But we mustn't eat green ones." "Not if they're too green," agreed Teddy. "But a little green won't hurt." They drove on, Knick-Knack trotting along the path through the woods, now and then stopping to nibble at the leaves. At last the children came to a beautiful shady spot, where many ferns grew beneath the trees, and it was so cool that they stopped their goat, tied him to an old stump, and sat down to eat some cookies their mother had given them. The curly tops nearly always became hungry when they were out on their little trips. "Wouldn't it be funny," remarked Ted, after a bit, "if we should see a bear?" "Theodore Martin," gasped Janet. "I wish you'd keep quiet. It makes me scared to hear you say that." "Well, I was only foolin'," and Teddy dropped a G, a habit of which his mother was trying to break him, and he did not often forget. "If I saw a bear," began Janet, "I'd just scream," and suddenly she stopped because of a queer look she saw on her brother's face. Teddy dropped the cookie he had been about to bite and, pointing toward a hollow log that lay not far off, said, in a hoarse whisper, "Look, Jan, it is a bear." Chapter 7. Jan sees something. For a moment after her brother had said this, Janet did not speak. She, too, dropped the cookie she had just taken from the bag and turned slowly around to see at what Teddy was pointing. She was just in time to see something furry and reddish-brown in color dart into the hollow log, which was open at both ends. Then Jan gave a scream. "Oh!" exclaimed Ted, who was as much frightened by Janet's shrill voice as he was at what he had seen. "Oh, Jan, don't." "I couldn't help it," she answered. "I told you I'd scream if I saw a bear, and I did see one." "It is a bear, isn't it, Teddy?" "It is," he answered. "I saw it first. It's my bear." "You can have it, every bit of it," said Jan, quickly getting up from the mossy rock on which she had been sitting. "I don't want any of it, not even the stubby tail. I like to own half of Knick-Knack with you, but I don't want half a bear." "Then I'll take all of it, it's my bear," went on Ted. "Where are you going, Jan?" he asked as he saw his sister hurrying away. "I'm going home. I don't like it here. I'm going to make Knick-Knack run home with me." Teddy got up, too. He did not stop to pick up the cookie he had dropped. "I guess I'll go with you, Jan," he said. "I guess my bear will stay in the log until I come back." "Are you coming back?" asked Janet, as with trembling fingers she unfastened Knick-Knack's strap from around the stump to which he had been tied. "I'm going to get Grandpa to come back with me and shoot the bear," replied Ted. "I want his skin to make a rug. You know, like Grandpa did with the bear his father shot." Jan did not say anything. She got into the cart and turned the goat about, ready to leave the place. She gave a look over her shoulder at the hollow log into which she and Ted had seen the furry, brown animal crawl. It did not seem to be coming out, and Jan was glad of that. "Gadap, Knick-Knack," she called to the goat, and as the animal started off, Ted jumped into the wagon from behind. "I wish I had a gun," he said. "You're too little," declared January. "Oh, Ted, what if he should chase us?" Was it an awful big bear? I didn't dare look much. It wasn't so very big. Was it as big as Knick-Knack? Oh, bigger and him a lot. Oh, and again Jan looked back over her shoulder. "I hope he doesn't chase us," she added. "I'll fix him if he does," threatened Ted. "I'll fix him." "How? You haven't any gun, and maybe you couldn't shoot it if you had. Lesson maybe it was your Christmas pop gun." "Pooh. Pop guns wouldn't be any good to shoot a bear. You've got to have real bullets. But I can fix this bear if he chases us," and Ted tried to look brave. "How?" asked Jan again. She felt safer now. For Knick-Knack was going fast, and the hollow log, into which the furry animal had crawled, was out of sight. "I'll make our goat buck the bear with his horns if he chases us. That's what I'll do," declared Ted. "Oh, that would be good," exclaimed Jan in delight. "Knick-Knack is brave and his horns are sharp. 'Member how he stuck Em in the fence one day?" "Yes," answered Ted, "I do. And I'll get him to stick Em in the bear if he comes too close." "Gadap, Knick-Knack," and Ted flicked the goat with the ends of the reins. I think he wanted the goat to go faster so there would be no danger of the bears chasing after him and his sister. Perhaps Ted thought Knick-Knack might be afraid of the bear, even if the goat did have sharp horns. The Curly Tops were greatly excited when they reached the camp. Trouble was playing out in front and Grandpa Martin had just landed in the boat. "What's that?" he cried when he heard Ted's story. "A bear in a hollow log? Nonsense. There are no bears on Star Island." "But I saw it, and so did Janet." "Didn't you, Jan?" cried Ted. "I saw something fuzzy with a big tail going inside the log," answered Teddy's sister. "Then it couldn't have been a bear," laughed Grandpa Martin. "For a bear has only a little short, stubby tail. I'll go to see what it is. I think I know, however." "What?" asked Mother Martin. "Don't go into any danger, Father." "I won't," promised the farmer. "But I won't tell you what I think the animal is until I see it. I may be mistaken. Maybe it's a twomp," put in Trouble, who seemed to be thinking about them as much as Ted thought about the fallen star. "Tramps aren't animals," laughed January. "Furry animals anyway," added Ted. "Well, you stay here and I'll go see what it was," went on Grandpa, and he started off toward the hollow log with a big club. He was not gone very long, and when he came back he was laughing, as he had the night before when Knick-Knack gave them a scare. "Just as I thought," cried the children's grandpa. "It was a big, red fox in the hollow log." "And not a bear?" asked Ted. "Not a bear, Curly Top. Only a fox that was more frightened by you than you were by him, I guess." "I knew it couldn't be a bear. How did you get it out of the log?" asked January. "Oh, I just tapped on the log with my club." And Mr. Fox must have thought it was somebody knocking at his front door, for out he ran, looked at me with his bright eyes, and then away he ran into the woods. So you Curly Tops needn't be afraid. The fox won't hurt you." "I'm glad of that," said January. "Now let's go fishing, Ted." "All right," he agreed. "Can't you take Trouble with you?" asked his mother. "I want to help Nora and Grandpa do a little work around the camp." "Yes, we'll take him," agreed January. But you mustn't put any salt in the water, trouble and scare the fish. I not do it. I touch a fist myself. They gave him a pole and a line without any hook on it so he could not scratch himself, and then Jan and Ted sat down under a shady tree, not far from camp, to try to catch some fish. They knew how, for their father had taught them, and soon Jan had landed a good-sized sunfish. A little later Ted caught a perch which had stripes on its sides, like a zebra, as Jan said. After that, Jan and Ted each caught 2 fish, and they soon had enough to cook. "What do you curly tops want me to do with these?" asked Nora, as the 2 children came along, laughing and shouting, with the fish dangling from strings each of them carried. "Cook 'em, of course," cried Teddy. "That's what we caught them for. Nor to have you cook them." "But won't they bite me?" asked the cook, pretending to be afraid. "Oh no, they can't," explained January. "They bit on our hooks and now they can't bite any more." "But we can bite them," said Teddy. "Oh, would you bite the poor fish?" asked Nora. For a moment the curly tops did not know what to answer. Then Teddy replied, "Oh well. It can't hurt 'em to bite 'em after they're cooked, can it?" "No, I guess not," laughed Nora. "No more than it can hurt a baked potato." "Well, run along and I get the fish ready for dinner. Or whatever you call the next meal. I declare, I'm so mixed up with this camping business that I hardly know breakfast from supper. But run along, and I'll fry the fish for you, anyhow." "Let's go and take a walk," proposed Jan, when they had washed their hands in the tin basin that Mother Martin had set on a bench under a tree, with a towel and soap nearby. "For fish did leave such a funny smell on your hands," the little girl said. "Where'll we walk to?" asked Teddy. "Oh, let's go and look. Maybe we can find that cute little bunny we saw when we were looking for the den where the fox lived but didn't find him," proposed January. "All right," answered Teddy, and they set off. They had not gone very far before Teddy stopped near a bush and began to look about him. "What's the matter?" asked his sister. "Why, I saw a bird fly out of here," answered her brother. "And it seemed just as if it had a broken wing. It couldn't fly hardly." "Where is it?" asked Jan eagerly. "Maybe if we take it to Mother she can fix the wing. Once she mended a dog's broken leg, and he could walk most as good as ever when he got well, only he limped a little." "But a dog can't fly," said Teddy. "I know it," agreed January. "But if Mother can mend a broken leg, she can fix a broken wing." "Can't she?" "Maybe," admitted her brother. "Oh, there's the bird again, Jan. See how it flutters along." And the little boy pointed to one that was dragging itself along over the ground as though its wings or legs were broken or hurt. "Come on," cried Teddy. "Maybe we can catch the bird, Jan." Brother and sister started after the little feathered songster, which was making a queer, chirping noise. Then Jan suddenly called, "Oh, here's another." And, surely enough, there was a second bird acting almost as was the first, fluttering along, half hopping and half flying through the grass. "We'll get 'em both," yelled Teddy, and he and Jan hurried along. But somehow or other, as soon as they came almost to the place where they could reach out and touch one of the birds, which acted as though it could not go a bit farther, the little creature would manage to flutter on just beyond the eager hands of the children. "That's funny," exclaimed Teddy. "I almost had one of 'em that time." "So did I," added Janet. Now I'm sure I can get this one, and she ran forward to grasp the fluttering bird, but it managed to hop along, just out of her reach. The one Ted was after did the same thing. And for some time the children hurried on after the birds. At last the two songsters, with little chirps and calls, suddenly flew high in the air and circled back through the woods. "Well, would you look at that?" cried Teddy in surprise. "They can fly, after all," gasped Janet. "What do you suppose made Em pretend they couldn't?" "I guess they wanted to fool us," said her brother. And that really was it. The little birds had built a nest in a low bush, close to the ground where the children could easily have reached it if they had seen it. And they were very close to it, though their eyes had not spied it. But the birds had seen the curly tops and, fearing that Jan and Ted might take out the eggs in the nest, the wise little birds had pretended to be willing to let the boy and girl catch them instead of robbing the nest. Of course, Jan and Ted wouldn't have done such a thing as that. But the birds knew no differently. Not all birds act this way pretending to be hurt, or that they can't fly to get people to chase after them, and so keep far away from the little nests. But this particular kind of bird always does that. Someday, if you're in the woods or the fields and see one bird or two acting in this queer way, as though it could not fly or walk, and as though it wanted you to hurry after it and try to catch it, if you see a bird acting that way, you may be sure you are near its nest and eggs, and this is the way the bird does to get you away. "Let's look for their nest," suggested Teddy, when the two birds had flown far away, back through the woods. "Oh, no," answered January. "We don't want to scare them. Maybe we can look at the nest of a bird that won't mind if we watch her feeding her little ones." And a little later, they came to a bush in which was a robin's nest. In it were some tiny birds, and by standing on their tiptoes and bending the nest down a little way, the curly tops could look in. The baby birds, which had only just begun to grow feathers, opened their mouths as wide as they could, thinking, I suppose, that Jan and Ted had worms or bugs for them. But the children did not have. "Your mother will soon be along to feed you," said Janet, and soon the mother bird did come flying back from the field. She seemed afraid at first, when she saw how close Jan and Ted were to her nest, but the children soon walked away. And then the robin fed her young. Ted and Jan had a nice walk through the woods, and then they went back to camp. "We'll take Trouble for a walk, so Mother won't have to look after him so much," said Janet. "Come, Trouble, show me where the fox was," begged baby William, and Ted and Jan turned their steps that way. But there was no sign of the big-tailed animal in the hollow log, though the children pounded on it as Grandpa Martin said he had done. Then they wandered on a little farther in the beautiful woods. Jan saw some flowers she wanted to gather, and leaving the path where Ted stood to take care of his little brother, she began picking a handful. Janet saw so many pretty blossoms that she went a little farther than she meant to, and before she knew it, she had lost sight of her two brothers, though she could hear them talking. Suddenly, after crawling through some bushes, Jan found herself on another path. On the other side of it, she saw some black-eyed Susans. "Oh, I must get some of them," she cried. She darted across the path, and as she was about to pick the flowers, she saw, standing behind a big tree, a man who had on very ragged clothes. He looked at Jan, who dropped her bouquet and gasped, "Oh, oh dear." The The ragged man looked at Janet and smiled. But Jan did not smile. One thought only was in her mind. Here is one of the tramps. Illustration. Here is one of the tramps. Chapter 8 Trouble Falls In. Janet Martin thought it must have been all of 5 minutes that she stood staring at the ragged man, and he at her, though very likely. It was only a few seconds. A little while seems very long sometimes. For instance, waiting for a train or for the day of the party to come. Are you looking for anything? The man asked of Janet after a while. He doesn't speak like a tramp, thought the little girl, who had occasionally heard them asking Nora at the back door at home for something to eat. I guess I'll answer him. So she replied, I'm looking for flowers. Well, there are some pretty ones here in the woods, went on the ragged man. I saw some fine red ones a little while ago. If I had known I should meet you, I would have picked them for you. I wonder if he can be a tramp, thought Janet. Do tramps pick flowers or want to pick them? What she said was, thank you. But I think I have enough now. Yes, you have a nice bouquet, went on the ragged man, still smiling. He was dressed like a tramp, that was certain. But somehow or other, Janet did not feel as afraid as she expected she would be when she thought of meeting a tramp. Do you live around here? The man continued. Yes, we're camping in a tent, Jan replied. My grandfather owns part of this island, and we're with him, my mother, and my brothers. We like it here. Yes, it's fine, said the ragged man, who Janet thought must be a tramp. Even if he did not talk like most of them. So you live in a tent? Does the professor stay here all the while? The professor, repeated Janet, and she wondered what the long word meant. She was sure she had heard it before. Pretty soon she remembered. At school, she had heard some of the teachers speak of the principal as professor. My grandpa isn't a professor, explained Janet with a smile. He's a farmer. Well, some farmers are scientists. Maybe he is a scientist, went on the tramp. I was wondering if someone else was on this island looking for the same thing I'm looking for. Can you tell me, little girl? But just then, from somewhere back in the woods, a voice called. The ragged man listened a moment, and then he cried, All right, I'm coming. Janet saw him stoop and pick up off the ground a canvas bag, through the opening of which she saw stones, such as might be picked up on the shore of the lake or almost anywhere on the island. I hope I shall see you again, little girl, went on the tramp. As Janet called him afterward when telling the story. And when I do, I hope I'll have some red flowers for you. Goodbye. Janet was so surprised by the quick way in which the man ran off through the woods with his bag of stones that she did not answer or say goodbye. She just stood looking at the quivering bushes which closed up behind him and showed which way the man had gone. Janet could not see him any longer. A moment later, she heard the bushes behind her crackling, and, turning quickly, she saw Ted and Trouble coming toward her. What's the matter? Called her older brother. Did you see another bear? I mean a fox? No, but I saw a tramp man, replied Janet. Oh, but he was awful ragged. A tramp, cried Ted. Then we'd better get away from here. We'd better go and tell Grandpa. Janet thought the same thing, and after telling Ted all that had happened and what she and the man had said, the Curlytops hurried back through the woods to the camp. A ragged man on the island, is that it? Asked Grandpa Martin when Jan told him what had happened. It must be as Mr. Crittenden said, that there are tramps here. Though what they are doing I don't know. There isn't anything to eat here, except what we brought. And you haven't missed anything, have you, Nora? Has anybody been taking your strawberry shortcake or apple dumplings from the tent kitchen? No, Mr. Martin, they haven't, Nora answered. Well, maybe it was a tramp and perhaps it wasn't, said Grandpa Martin. Still, it will be a good thing to have a look about the island. I don't want strange men roaming where they please, scaring the children. Oh, he didn't scare me. Except at first, Janet hastened to say. He spoke real nice to me, but his clothes were old and awful ragged. He wanted to know if you were a professor. Well, I guess I'm professor enough to drive away tramps that won't work and only want to eat what other people get, returned the farmer. I'll have a look around this island tomorrow and drive away the tramps. And until then, don't you curly tops go far away. Stay where I can watch you, went on Mrs. Martin, shaking her finger at them, half in fun, but a great deal in earnest. We'll stay near the tent, promised January. I'm going to help Grandpa hunt the tramps, declared Ted. No, Curly Top, you'd better stay with your sister and mother, said the farmer. I don't really believe there are any tramps here. But I saw him, insisted Janet. I know you saw someone, curly girl, and Grandpa smiled at her. Of course, there may be a strange man maybe too. For you say you heard one call to the other. But they may have just stopped for a little while on this island. I'll have to ask them to go away, though. For we want to be by ourselves while camping. So, as there might be strangers around here who would not be pleasant, you'd better stay here, too, Teddy. All right, I'll stay, Teddy promised. And he tried to be happy and contented about it, though he did want to go with his grandfather on the tramp hunt, as he called it. But, though Teddy was quite a good-sized boy for his age, there were some things that it was not wise for him to do. This was one of them. The next day, Grandpa Martin, rowing over to the mainland, brought back with him one of his hired men. The two walked all over the island, only stopping for their lunch, and at night they had found no trace of anyone. If tramps were here, they have gone, said Grandpa Martin. I can't think why that man who talked to Janet should speak of a professor, though. It is queer, said Mrs. Martin. Never mind. I'm glad it is safe for the children to run about now. It has been hard work to keep them about the tents all this day. I guess it has been, laughed Grandpa Martin. Well, tomorrow they can run as much as they like. Ted and Janet had lots of fun, playing on the shores of Clover Lake. They took off their shoes and stockings and went wading. Trouble did the same, splashing about in his bare feet until he saw a little crawfish, darting from one stone to another underwater to hide away. Trouble, 'fraid of dem big water bugs, he said, as he ran out on the grassy bank. Don't want to wade anymore. And Ted and Jan could not get him to come in again that day. By this time the camp was well settled. They had stored away in the cooking tent many good things to eat. And whenever they wanted anything more, Grandpa Martin would route over to the store on the mainland for it. Daddy Martin wrote from Cresco, where he was looking after his store, that he would soon be back at Cherry Farm, and then he would come out to the camp and spend a week. The Curly Tops played all the games they knew. They took long rides with Knick-Knack, and often Trouble went with them. But it was not all play. Mrs. Martin thought it wise for Ted and Jan to have some work to do, so each day she gave them little tasks. They had to bring a small pail of water from the spring, gather wood for the evening campfire, and also some for Nora to use when she made the fire in the cook stove. For Nora was a good cook, and many a fine pie or cake came out of the oven. Sometimes Ted and Jan helped around the kitchen by drying the dishes or helping set the table or clear it off. One afternoon, when it was almost time to get supper, Mrs. Martin sent Ted to the spring for a pail of water. She wanted one so they could all have a fresh drink, as it was rather warm that day. "I'll go with you," offered Janet. "Me come too," added Trouble. "Yes, take him," said his mother to Janet. "He hasn't been out much today." So Trouble toddled off with his brother and sister. Ted filled the pail at the bubbling spring, which was a large one, out of sight of the tents of the camp. Then he heard a strange bird whistling in a tree overhead, and, setting down the pail, he ran to see what it was. "Oh," Jan called her brother a moment later, "it's a big red and black bird. Awful pretty. Come and see him." Jan ran to get a look at the scarlet tanager. As Grandpa said later it was, and without thinking, she left Trouble alone. Well, you can well imagine what Trouble did. For a long while ever since he had been in camp. In fact, baby William had wanted to dip a pail of water out of the spring. But of course he could not be allowed to do this, for he might fall in. Now, however, he saw his chance. "Trouble bring de water," he said, talking to himself while Teddy and Janet were looking at the pretty bird. The little fellow carefully emptied the pail his brother had filled. Then with it in his hand, he went slowly toward the spring. He leaned over, but longer arms than his were needed to reach the pail down into the bubbling water. Trouble reached and stretched and reached again, and then, splash, baby William had fallen in. Chapter 9. Ted finds a cave. Janet and Ted returned from looking at the pretty scarlet bird just in time to see what happened to Trouble. They saw him fall into the spring. "Oh!" cried Janet, clasping her hands. "Oh, look! He'll be drowned," yelled Ted, and then he ran as fast as he could toward the place where he had last seen his little brother, for baby William was not in sight now. He was down in the water. Perhaps Trouble might not have come to any harm, more than to get wet through by the time Ted reached him. Perhaps the little fellow might not have been drowned. At any rate, no harm came to him, even though Jan and her brother did not get there in time to help. The two curly tops, their fuzzy hair fluttering in the wind, were halfway to the spring when they saw coming from the bushes a ragged man. "There he is," cried Janet. "Who?" asked Ted. "The man who talked to me while I was picking flowers." And Jan's voice came in gasps, for she was getting out of breath from having run so hard. "There he is," and she pointed. "That's the tramp," cried Ted. "They are on the island. Only Grandpa couldn't find M. Do you suppose he's going to take Trouble?" faltered Janet. Before Ted could answer, the curly top saw what the ragged man was going to do. They saw him stoop over the spring, reach down into it, and lift something up. The something was baby William, screaming and crying in fright and dripping wet. The ragged man set Trouble down on a rock near the spring, and then, waving his hand to Ted and Jan, he cried, "He's all right, swallowed hardly any water. Take him home as soon as you can, though. I haven't time to stop, have to go to see the professor." With that, the man seemed to dive in between some high bushes, and the curly tops could not see him any more. But Trouble was still sitting on the rock, the water from his clothes making a little puddle all around him, and he was crying hard, his tears running down his cheeks. "Oh, trouble!" gasped Jan, putting her arms around him, all wet as he was. "Are you hurt?" asked Ted, looking carefully at his little brother. I fell fallen in, eyes all wetted," wailed Trouble, his breath coming in gasps because of his crying, which he had partly stopped on seeing his brother and sister. "I falled into swing, I did." "What made you?" asked Ted, while Jan tried to wring some of the water out of the little fellow's waist and rompers. "I wanted to get a pail full for Mama, but I filled the pail, Trouble." "You oughtn't to have touched it," said Teddy. He went to the spring and looked down in it. The pail was at the bottom of the little pool. "It's a good thing that Tramp got him out," remarked Janet. "He must be a nice man, even if his clothes are ragged." "I guess so, too," agreed Ted. "But he said we must take Trouble home." "I guess we'd better." "Yes," assented January. "But he isn't hurt." "He wasn't in very long," Ted said. "The man got him out awful quicker than we could. You lead him home, Jan, and I'll get the pail out of the spring. It's sunk like a ship." "How are you going to get it?" "With a stick, I guess." "You mustn't lean over the spring anymore, Trouble." "No," promised Baby William. But the Curlytops could not be sure he would keep his promise. He might for a time, while he remembered what had happened to him. With a crooked stick, Teddy managed to fish up the pail after 2 or 3 trials. Then, filling it with water from the spring, he carried it back to camp, while Jan led the wet and dripping Trouble. "Oh my goodness! What's happened now?" asked Nora as she saw the 3 children coming into camp. "Did you go in swimming with all your clothes on, Trouble?" "No. I falled into the swing, I did. And the Tramp got him out," added January. Then she and Teddy, taking turns, told what had happened. Mrs. Martin scolded Trouble a little to make him more careful the next time. Then Grandpa Martin said, "Well, there must be strangers on this island after all, though I could not find them. They must be hiding somewhere, and I'd like to know what for." "Maybe they're living in gypsy wagons," suggested January. "Or in a cave," added Ted. "They look as if they lived in a cave." "There isn't any cave on the island, as far as I know," his grandfather told Ted. "But I don't like those strange men roaming about our place here. They may not do any harm, but I don't like it. I'll have another look for them." "So will I," added Teddy, but he did not say this aloud. Teddy had made up his mind to do something. He was going to look for those men himself, either in a cave or a gypsy wagon. Ted wanted to find the ragged man, find all of them if more than one, and there seemed to be at least 2. For the one who had pulled Teddy out of the spring had spoken of another, a professor. "What's a professor?" asked January. "Oh, it's a man or a woman who has studied his lessons and teaches them to others," answered her mother. "One who knows a great deal about something, such as about the stars or about the world we live in. Professors find out many things and then tell others young people generally about them." "I'm going to be a professor," said Teddy. "Are you?" inquired his mother with a smile. "I hope you will get wise enough to be one." But Teddy did not speak all that was in his mind. If a professor was one who found out things, then the small boy decided he would be one long enough to find out about the Tramps, and perhaps find the cave where they lived, and then he could tell Jan. When Trouble had been put into dry clothes and sent to sleep by his mother singing, "Ding dong bell, pussy's in the well," Jan and Ted sat by themselves, talking over what had happened that day. Ted was making a small boat to sail on the lake, and Jan was mending her doll's dress, where a prickly briar bush had torn a little hole in it. Early the next morning, Ted slipped away from his place at the breakfast table and motioned to Jan to join him behind the sleeping tent. Ted held his finger over his lips to show his sister that he wanted her to keep very quiet. "What's the matter?" she whispered when they were safe by themselves. "Did you see the tramp man?" "No, but I'm going to find him." "You are?" cried Janet, and her eyes opened wide with wonder and surprise. "Don't tell anybody," went on Ted. "We don't want Trouble to follow us. Come on off this way." And he pointed to a path that led through the bushes back of the tent. Trouble was busy just then, playing in the sand on the shore of Clover Lake, while Mrs. Martin and Nora were clearing away the breakfast things. Grandpa Martin was raking up around the tents, so no one saw the curly top slip away. "Which way are you going?" asked Jan of her brother. "Over to the spring." "What for? To get more water? Where's your pail?" "I don't have to get water yet," answered Ted. "I'm going to the spring to look to see if I can tell which way that tramp went. Don't you know how Indians do look at the leaves and grass in the woods, and they can tell by the marks which way anybody went? Mother read us a story once like that." "I don't like Indians," remarked Jan somewhat shortly, half turning back. "Oh, there's no Indians," exclaimed Ted impatiently. "I was only saying what they did. Come on." So Jan followed her brother, though she was a little bit afraid. However, she saw nothing to frighten her, and it was nice in the woods. The wind was blowing through the trees, the birds were singing, and it was cool and pleasant. The curly top soon came to the spring where Trouble had fallen in. "Now we must look all around," declared Teddy. "What for?" his sister demanded again. "To tell which way the tramp man went. Then we can find his cave. Maybe he lives in a wagon or a tent. Then we'll find them. Come on, help look." "I don't know how," confessed Janet. "Well, look for a place where the bushes are broken down and where you see footprints in the dirt. That's the way Indians tell. Mother read it out of a book to us." So Jan and Ted looked all around the spring, and at last Ted found a place where it seemed as if someone had run through in a hurry, for twigs were broken off the bushes, and by looking down at the ground, he saw the marks of shoes in the dirt. Of course, Ted could not tell who had made them, but he thought surely it must have been the tramp who had pulled Trouble from the spring. Ted was sure they were not the footprints of himself and his sister, for their own were much smaller. "Come on, Jan," cried Teddy. "We'll find that tramp now, or anyway, the place where he hides." He pushed on through the bushes. There seemed to be a sort of path leading away from the spring, which was not the same path that Ted and Grandpa Martin took when they went from the camp to the water hole to fill the pail each day. On and on went Ted, with Jan following. She was so excited now at the thought that perhaps they might find something that she was not a bit frightened. "Wait a minute. Wait for me, Teddy," she called, as her brother hurried on ahead of her. "Come on, Jan," he called. "There's a good path here, and I guess I see something. Oh, look here. Oh, Jan. Oh! Oh!" suddenly cried Teddy. Then his voice seemed to fade away, as if he had all at once gone down the cellar, and Jan could hear him calling faintly. "Oh, Teddy, what's the matter? What's the matter?" she cried as she ran on through the bushes. "I've found the cave," was his answer, so faint and far away that Jan could hardly hear. "I've found the cave. I fell right into it. Come on." Chapter 10. The grapevine swing. Wondering what had happened to her brother, Jan hurried on toward the place from which his voice came. It sounded more than ever as if he were down a cellar. "But there can't be any cellars in these woods," thought the little girl. "Where are you, Teddy?" she called after a bit. "I can't see you." "Here I am, right behind you," was the answer, and Jan, turning quickly, saw the head of her brother sticking up out of a hole in the ground. "Oh! Oh!" exclaimed Ted's sister. "Where's the rest of you? Where's your legs and your feet?" "Down in the hole," explained Teddy. "I'm in the cave. I fell in. That's how I found it." "Is it a real cave?" asked Janet. "It is. It goes away back under the ground, only I didn't go in 'cause it's so dark." "I'm going to get a light and see what's there." "I'm not," said Jan, very decidedly. "Well, then I'll get Grandpa. Maybe this is the cave where the tramps live. Come and look where I am. You won't fall in." "How did you find it?" asked Janet as she walked toward the hole, down in which Teddy was standing. It was a little way from the path the two curly tops had walked along through the woods, the path leading from the spring. "I just fell in it, I told you," Ted answered. "I was walking along and all at once I slipped down through the dried leaves. First I thought I was going down in a big hole, but it isn't over my head and a lot of leaves went down with me. So I didn't get jounced hardly at all." Jan went to the edge and looked down in the hole. It seemed to be a large one in between two big rocks, and Ted showed her where the hole slanted downward and went farther underground. It was dark there, and Jan made up her mind she would never go into it, even if Ted did. "You'd better come up," she said at last. "Maybe Mother wouldn't like it. Besides, there might be snakes down in there." "Oh!" "I didn't think about them," exclaimed Ted, and he tried to scramble up. But it was not so easy as he had hoped. He was a little excited, too, since Janet had spoken of snakes. Teddy did not like them, and they might be in among the leaves that had fallen down into the hole with him. "Can't you get up?" Jan asked when her brother had slipped back 2 or 3 times. "Maybe I could if you'd let me take hold of your hand," suggested Teddy. "Then you'd pull me in and we'd both be down there." Ted saw that this was so. He tried again to get out, but could not. For mixed with the leaves were many dry, brown pine needles from the trees growing overhead. And if you have ever been in the woods, you know how slippery pine needles are when the ground is covered with them. Teddy slipped back again and again. "Oh, Ted, can't you ever get up?" asked Janet, almost ready to cry. "Oh!" "I'll get out somehow," he said. Then, dangling down from a tree behind his sister, he saw a long wild grapevine, which was almost like a piece of rope. "If I had hold of it, I could pull myself out," Teddy said. "See if you can reach it to me, January." After 2 or 3 trials, his sister did this. Then, holding to a loose end of the grapevine while the other end was twined fast round a tree, Teddy pulled himself out of the hole. Once on firm ground, he made the loose end of the grapevine fast to a stone that lay near the edge of the hole. "What made you do that?" asked Janet. "So the next time I get down there I can pull myself out," Teddy answered. "Are you going down there again?" Jan queried. "Course I am," declared Ted. "I didn't half look in the cave. It's a big place. I could see in only a little way, 'cause it was so dark. I'm going to tell Grandpa and have him bring a lantern." Grandpa Martin was surprised when Ted and Jan told him what they had found in the woods. "I didn't suppose there was a cave on the island," said the farmer. "I must have a look at it. And may I come? And will you take a lantern?" asked Teddy eagerly. "Well, yes, I guess so," said Grandpa slowly. "Oh, Father, do you think it is safe?" asked Mrs. Martin. "Yes, I think so. I won't go very far in with the children. It may be only the den of a fox or some small animal and not a real cave." "I think it's a big cave," declared Ted. "Come on, Grandpa." "Me come," cried Trouble. As the two curly tops set off with Grandpa Martin through the woods toward the place where Teddy had fallen down with the pile of leaves. "Me come." "No, you stay with me," laughed Mother Martin, catching him up in her arms. Trouble did not want to stay behind, not having been with his brother and sister of late as much as he wished. "We'll bake a patty cake," Mrs. Martin added, and then Trouble laughed, for he liked to help Nora bake. That is, he thought he helped. And at least he helped to eat what Nora took out of the oven. "Now show me where the cave is," said Grandpa Martin to Ted as they neared the place. "But be careful not to fall into it again." "Oh, I've got a grapevine rope so I can pull myself out," said Jan's brother. "Here it is, over this way." Teddy Martin was an observing little fellow. He could find his way around in the woods very well, once he had been to a place. And he did not go wrong this time. He led his grandfather right to the entrance of the cave. And it proved to be a real cave. Grandpa Martin found this out when he jumped down into the place where Teddy had fallen, and when the lantern had been lighted and flashed into the dark hole. "Yes, it's a cave all right," the children's grandfather said. "And to think the many times I've been on this island I never found it. Well, I'll go in a little way." "Can't I come?" asked Ted, as he saw his grandfather start into the dark hole which spread out from the open place into which Ted had fallen. "I'm not coming," declared Janet, "and I don't want to stay here all alone." "You stay there with your sister, Curly Top," directed Mr. Martin. "If I find out it's all right and is safe, I'll come back and take you both in a little way." Grandpa Martin walked into the dark hole, his lantern flickering like a firefly at night. The Curly Tops watched it until they could no longer see the gleam. Then they waited expectantly. "Maybe something'll grab Grandpa," said Jan after a bit. "What?" asked Ted. "A fox or something." "Pooh, he isn't afraid of a fox." "Well, a bear, maybe." "There isn't any bears here." "Janet Martin, I'm not afraid." Perhaps Ted said this because, just then, he saw his grandfather coming out of the cave. The farmer had not been gone very long. "Is it a cave?" called Ted. "A sure enough one?" added his sister. "Yes, it's a sure enough cave. But there's nothing in it. No wild animals," Jan demanded. "Not even a mouse, as far as I could see," laughed Mr. Martin. "But someone had been in the cave eating his lunch. Maybe there was a picnic," Grandpa suggested Ted. "No, I think only 1 or 2 persons were in the big hole," said his grandfather. "For it is a big hole, larger than I thought it was. I could stand up straight once I was inside." "Take us in," begged Ted. "Yes, I think it will be all right. Come along, January. I'll hold your hand." and there isn't anything of which to be afraid. Come on." So Janet and Teddy went into the cave. By the light of Grandpa's lantern, they could see that it was a large place. A regular underground house, a cave, just like those of which they had read in fairy stories. "And was there somebody here, really?" asked Ted eagerly. "Yes," answered his grandfather. "See, here are bits of bread scattered about, and papers in which someone brought his lunch here." "Maybe it was the tramps," whispered Janet. "Maybe," agreed Mr. Martin. "I must have another look over the island." There was not much else in the cave that they could see with the one lantern. Grandpa Martin wanted to look about more and back in the far corners, but he did not like to take the children along, and Jan held tightly to his hand as if she feared she would lose him. "I'll come here alone some other time and see what I can find," thought Grandpa Martin to himself as they came out. "I don't like it in there," said Jan, once they were again out in the sunshine. "I don't like caves." "I do," declared Ted. "When Hal Chester comes to visit me, as he said he would, he and I will look all through this cave." "Is Hal coming?" asked Jan, remembering the boy, once lame but now cured, who had played with them and told them about Princess Blue Eyes. "Yes, Mother asked him to come and spend a week, and he said he would. We'll have some fun in the cave." "What do you suppose the big hole can be?" asked Mrs. Martin, when Grandpa Martin and the children reached camp after their visit to the strange place. "I don't know," he answered. "It doesn't seem to have been dug with picks and shovels. It's just a natural cave, I guess, and some fishermen may have eaten their lunch there one day when it rained. But there is no one in it now." Ted and Jan talked much about the cave the rest of that day. They went for a ride in the wagon drawn by Knick-Knack, taking Trouble with them. On their way back, Jan said, "Oh, I wish I had a swing." "It would be fun," agreed Ted. "Maybe I can make one." "You'll have to get a rope," said his sister. "Grandpa is going to row over in the boat tomorrow. Ask him to bring us one." "No, he don't need to bring us a rope," went on her brother. "Why not?" "'Cause I can get a rope in the woods." "A rope in the woods?" "Oh, Teddy Martin, you cannot. Ropes don't grow on trees." "The kind I mean does," answered Ted with a laugh. "Wait and I'll show you." When Knick-Knack had been put in the new stable which Grandpa Martin had built for him, Teddy, followed by Jan and Trouble, walked a little way into the woods. Ted carried with him a piece of old carpet. "What's that for?" his sister asked. "For a swing board," he answered. "But where's the swing rope?" "Here," cried Ted suddenly. He pointed to a long wild grapevine which hung dangling between two trees around which it was twined. The vine was a very long one, and as thick around as the piece Teddy had used to pull himself out of the hole near the cave. It did seem like a regular swing. "Well, maybe," murmured January. "Now we can have some fun," cried Ted. He folded the piece of carpet and laid it over the grapevine. Then he sat down, gave a push on the ground with his feet, and away he swung as nicely as though he was in a regular swing, made with a rope from the store. "Oh, how nice," cried Janet. "Let me try it, Teddy. Wait till I see if it's strong enough." He swung back and forward several more times and then let his sister try it. She, too, swayed to and fro in the grapevine swing, which was in a shady place in the woods. Then Trouble, who had seen what was going on, cried, "I want to swing, too. I want to swing." "I'll take you on my lap," offered Janet, and this she did. "I'll push you," offered Teddy, and he gave his sister and his baby brother a long push in the grapevine swing. But just as they were going nicely and Trouble was laughing in delight, there was a sudden cracking sound and Janet cried, "Oh, I'm falling. I'm falling. The swing is coming down." And that is just what happened. Chapter 11 Trouble makes a cake with a crackle and a snap. The grapevine swing sagged down on one side. Janet tried to hold Trouble in her arms, but he slipped from her lap just as she slipped off the piece of carpet which Ted had folded for the seat of the swing. Then Janet toppled down as the vine broke, and she and her little brother came together in a heap on the ground. "Oh!" exclaimed Ted. "Are you hurt?" Neither Jan nor Trouble answered him for a moment. Then Baby William began to cry. Jan lay still on the ground for a second or two, and then she jumped up with a laugh. "I'm not hurt a bit," she said. "I fell right in a pile of leaves, and it was like jouncing up and down in the hay." "What's the matter with Trouble?" asked Ted. Baby William kept on crying. "Never mind. Put in January. Sister'll kiss it and make it all better. Where's you hurt, Trouble dear?" The little fellow stopped crying and looked up at Jan, his eyes filled with tears. "My posy tree is hurted," he said, holding a broken flower out to his sister. "Swing broke my posy tree." Trouble called any weed, flower, or bunch of grass he happened to pick a posy tree. "Oh, I guess he isn't hurt," remarked Teddy. "If it's only a broken posy tree, I'll get you another," he said kindly. "Are you all right, Trouble? Can you stand up?" For he feared, after all, lest Baby William's legs might have been hurt, since they were doubled up under him. Trouble showed he was all right by getting up and walking about. He had stopped crying, and Ted and Jan could see that he, too, had fallen on a pile of soft leaves near the swing, so he was only jiggled up, as Jan called it. One side of the grapevine swing had torn loose from the tree, and thus it had come down with Jan and Trouble. "I guess it wasn't strong enough for two," said Ted. "Maybe I can find another grapevine." "I'd like a rope swing better," Janet said. "Then it wouldn't tumble down." "I guess that's so," agreed her brother. "We'll ask Grandpa to get one." Grandpa Martin laughed when he heard what had happened to the grapevine swing and promised to make a real one of rope for the curly tops. This he did a day or so afterward, so that Ted and Jan had a fine swing in their camp on Star Island, as well as one at Cherry Farm. They were two very fortunate children, I think, to have such a grandfather. "Where are you going now, Grandpa?" called Jan one day, as she saw the farmer getting the boat ready for use. "I'm going over to the mainland to get some things for our camp," answered Mr. Martin. They came from a big store and some boxes and crates, and they're at the railroad station. "I'm going over to get them. Do you curly tops want to come along?" "Well, I just guess we do," cried Ted. "Me want to come," begged Trouble. "Not this time, dear," said his mother. "You stay with me, and we will have some fun. Let Jan and Ted go." Trouble was going to cry, but when Nora gave him a cookie, he changed his mind and ate the little cake instead, though I think 1 or 2 tears splotched down on it and made it a bit salty. But Trouble did not seem to mind. Ted and Jan had lots of fun riding back in the boat to the main shore with their grandfather. When the boat was almost at the dock, Mr. Martin let the two children take hold of one of the oars and help him row. Of course, the curly tops could not pull very much, but they did pretty well. And it helped them to know how a boat is made to go through the water when it has no steam engine or gasoline motor to make it glide along, or sails on which the wind can blow to push it. You can't know too much about boats and the water, especially when you are camping on an island in the middle of a lake, said Grandpa Martin. When you get bigger, Ted and Jan, you'll be able to row a boat all by yourselves. Maybe day after tomorrow, suggested January. I wish I could now, said Ted. Oh, but you're too small, his grandfather said. The boat was tied to the wharf. And then, getting an expressman to go to the depot for the boxes and crates, Mr. Martin took the children with him on the wagon. We're having lots of fun, cried Jan as the horse trotted along. We're camping and we had a ride in a boat and now we're having a ride in a wagon. Lots of fun, agreed Ted. I'm glad we've got Grandpa. And Grandpa is glad he has you two curly tops to go camping with him, laughed the farmer, as the expressman made his horse go faster. At the depot. While the children were waiting to have the boxes and crates of things for the camp loaded into the wagon, Ted saw Arthur Weldon, a boy with whom he sometimes played. Hello, Art, called Ted. Hello, answered Arthur. I thought you were camping on Star Island. We are, answered Teddy. It doesn't look so, laughed Arthur, or Art, as most of his boy friends called him. Well, we just came over to get some things. There's Grandpa and the expressman with them now, went on Ted, as the two men came from the freight house with a number of bundles. I wish I was camping, went on the other boy. It isn't any fun around here. You can come over to see us sometimes, invited January. I'll ask my mother to let you, and you can play with us. He don't want to play girls' games, cried Ted. Well, I guess I can play boys' games as well as girls' games, exclaimed Janet with some indignation. Oh, yes, course you can, agreed her brother. And maybe Art can bring his sister to the island to see us, and then we could play boys' games and girls, too, went on January. I'll ask my mother, promised Arthur. Grandpa and the expressman soon had the wagon loaded, and Arthur rode back in it with the curly tops to the wharf where the boat was tied. All aboard for Star Island, cried Mr. Martin. When the things were in the boat, nearly filling it. All aboard. I wish I could come now, sighed Arthur. Well, we'd like to take you, said Grandpa Martin. But it wouldn't be a good thing to take you unless your mother knew you were coming with us, and we haven't time to go up to ask her now. The next time maybe we'll take you back with us. There was a wistful look on Arthur's face as he watched the boat being rowed away from the main shore and toward the island. Ted and Janet waved their hands to him and said they would ask their mother to invite him for a visit, which they did a few weeks later. Once back on the island, the things were taken out of the boat and then began the work of taking them out of the boxes and crates. There was a new oil stove to warm the tent on cool or rainy days, and other things for the camp, and when all had been unpacked there was quite a pile of boards and sticks left. I know what we can do with them, said Teddy to Janet when they had been piled in a heap not far from the shore of the lake and a little distance away from the tents. What? Asked the little girl. We can make a raft like Robinson Crusoe did, answered Teddy, for his mother had read him a little about the shipwrecked sailor who, as told in the storybook, lived so long alone on an island. What's a raft? Asked Janet. Oh, it's something like a boat, but it hasn't got any sides to it, only a bottom, answered her brother. You make it out of flat boards, and you have to push it along with a pole. We can make a raft out of all the boards and pieces of what Grandpa took the things out of. It'll be a lot of fun, Will Mother let us? Asked January. Oh, I guess so, answered Teddy. But he did not go to ask to find out. He found a hammer where Grandpa had been using it to knock apart the crates and boxes, and with the help of Jan, Teddy was soon making his raft. There were plenty of nails which had come out of the boxes and crates. Some of them were rather crooked, but when Ted tried to hammer them straight, he pounded his fingers. That hurts, he said. I guess crooked nails are as good as straight ones. Anyhow, this raft is going to be crooked. And it was very crooked and wobbly, as Janet called it, when Teddy had shoved it into the water and, taking off his shoes and stockings, got on it. Come on, Jan, he cried. I'm going to have a ride. No, it's too tippy, Janet answered. Oh, it can't tip over, said Teddy. That's what a raft is for, not to tip over. Maybe you can slide off, but it can't tip over. Come on. So Janet took off her shoes and stockings. Now, of course, she ought not to have done that, nor ought Teddy to have got on the raft without asking his mother or his grandfather. But then the Curlytops were no different from other children. So on the raft got Teddy and Janet, and for a time they had lots of fun pushing it around a shallow little cove, not far from the shore of Star Island. A clump of trees hid them from the sight of Mother Martin and Grandpa at camp. Let's go farther out, suggested Teddy after a bit. I'm afraid, replied Janet. It'll be all right, cried Ted. I won't let it tip over. So Janet let him pull out a little farther until she saw that the shore was far away, and then she cried, I want to go back. All right, answered Ted. I don't want anybody on my raft who's scared. I'll go alone. He pulled back to shore and Janet got off the raft. Then Teddy shoved the wobbly mass of boards and sticks, fastened together with crooked nails, out into the lake again. He had not gone very far before something happened. One end of the raft tipped up and the other end dipped down. Anoff slid Teddy into the water. Oh! Oh! Screamed Janet. You'll be drowned. I'm going to tell Grandpa. She ran to the camp with the news, and Mr. and Mrs. Martin came hurrying back. By this time, Teddy had managed to get up and was standing in the water, which was not deep. I'm all right, he stammered. Only I'm wet. I should say you were, exclaimed his mother. You mustn't go on any more rafts. Teddy promised that he would not, and then, when he had put on dry clothes, he and Janet played other games that were not so dangerous. They had lots of fun in the camp on Star Island. Come on, Jan called her brother one morning after breakfast. Come on down to the lake. What are you going to do? She asked. I think he had better look for the G you dropped, said Mrs. Martin with a laugh. What G? Asked January. The one off going was the answer. You must be more careful of your words, Janet dear. Learn to talk nicely and don't drop your G letters. She had been trying to teach this to the Curlytops for a long while, and they were almost cured of leaving off the final G of their words. But once in a while, just as Jan did that time, they forgot. What are you going to do? Asked Janet, slowly and carefully this time. Sail my boat, answered Ted. I'll give your doll a ride if you want me to. Not this one, replied his sister, looking at the one she carried. It had on a fine red dress. Why not that doll? Ted inquired. 'Cause your boat might tip over and spill my doll in the lake. Then she'd be spoiled and so would her dress. Wait. I'll get my rubber doll. Water won't hurt her. My boat won't tip over, Ted declared. It's a good one. But even Jan's rubber doll must have been too heavy for Ted's small boat, for, halfway across a little shallow cove in the lake, where the curly tops waited and Ted sailed his ships, the boat tipped to one side, and the doll was thrown into the water. There, I told you so, cried Janet. Well, she's rubber. And you can pretend she has on a bathing suit and has gone in swimming, declared Ted. But maybe a fish will bite a hole in her and then she can't whistle through the hole in her back, wailed Jan, ready to cry. There's no fish here, only baby ones, and they can't bite, Ted answered. But I'll get her for you, January. He waded out, set his ship upright again, and brought his sister's doll to shore. Nancy, which was the doll's name, did not seem to have been hurt by falling into the lake. Her painted smile was the same as ever. I guess I'll dress her now so she won't get cold after her bath, said Jan, who sometimes acted as though her dolls were really alive. She liked her playthings very much indeed. While his sister went back to the tent with her doll, Ted sailed his boat. Then Trouble came down to the edge of the little cove and began to take off his shoes and stockings to go wading as Ted was doing. Ted was not sure whether or not his mother wanted baby William to do this, so he decided to run up to the camp to ask, "Don't go in the water until I come back, Trouble," Ted ordered his little brother. But the sight of the cool, sparkling water was too much for baby William. Off came his shoes and stockings without waiting for Ted to come back to say whether or not Mother Martin would let him go splashing in the water. Into the lake baby William went. And he was not careful about getting wet, either, so that when Ted came back with his mother, who wanted to make sure that her baby boy was all right, they saw him out in the middle of the cove with Ted's boat, and the water was halfway up to Trouble's waist, the lower part of his bloomers being soaked. "Oh, you dear bunch of Trouble," cried his mother. "You mustn't do that." "Having fun," was all Trouble said. "Come here," cried Mrs. Martin. "Wait till I sailboat," and he pushed Ted's toy about in the cove, splashing more water on himself. "I guess you'll have to get him," said Mrs. Martin to Teddy, who half dragged, half led his little brother to shore. Trouble got wetter than ever during this, and his mother had to take him back to the tent to put dry things on him. "Trouble," she said, "you are a bad little boy. I'll have to keep you in camp the rest of the day now. After this you must not go in wading until I say you may. If you had had your bathing suit on, it would have been all right. Now you must be punished." Trouble cried and struggled, but it was of no use. When Mother Martin said a thing must be done, it was done, and Trouble could not play in the water again that day. Toward the middle of the afternoon, however, as he had been pretty good playing around the tent, he was allowed to roam farther off, though told he must not go near the water. "You stay with me, baby," called Nora. "I'm going to bake a cake and I'll give you some." "Trouble bake a cake, too?" he asked. "No, Trouble isn't big enough to bake a cake, but you can watch me. I'll get out the flour and sugar and other things, and I'll make a little cake just for you." On a table in the cooking tent, Nora set out the things she was to use for her baking. There was the bag of flour, some water in a dish, and other things. Just as she was about to mix the cake, Mrs. Martin called Nora away for a moment. "Now, Trouble, don't touch anything until I come back," warned the girl as she hurried out of the tent. "I won't be gone a minute." But she was gone longer than that. Left alone in the tent, with many things on the table in front of him, Trouble looked at them. He knew he could have lots of fun with some of the pans, cups, the egg beater, the flour, the water, and the eggs. A little smile spread over his tanned, chubby face. Trouble bake a cake, he said to himself. Nora bake a cake, Trouble bake a cake. Yes! First, Baby William pulled toward him the bag of flour. He managed to do it without upsetting it, for the bag was a small one. Near it was a bowl of water with a spoon in it. Trouble had seen his mother and Nora bake cakes, and he must have remembered that they mixed the flour and water together. Anyhow, that was the way to make mud pies, by mixing sand and water. Trouble looked for something to mix his cake in. The tins and dishes were so far back on the table that he could not get them easily. He must take something else. Off his head, Trouble pulled his white hat, a new one that Grandpa had brought only that day from the village store. Make cake and dis, murmured Baby William to himself. He pushed a chair up to the table and climbed upon it. From the chair, he got on the table and sat down. Then he began to make his cake in his hat. Illustration. Then Trouble began to make a cake in his hat. Page 138. Chapter 12. The Curlitops Go Swimming. Trouble make a cake. Trouble make a nice cake for Jan and Ted, murmured Baby William to himself. Certainly he thought he was going to do that, make a nice cake, but it did not turn out just that way. Trouble's hat, being of felt, held water just as a dish or a basin would have done. But the little fellow had to hold it very carefully in his lap between his knees as he sat on the table, or he would have squeezed his hat and the water would have spilled out. But when Trouble really wanted to do anything, he could be very careful. And he wanted, very much this time, to make that cake. So, when he had the water in his hat, he began to dip up some flour from the bag with a large spoon. When the little fellow thought he had enough flour sifted into the water in his hat, he began to stir it, just as he had seen Nora stir her cake batter. Around and around he stirred it, and then he found that his cake was much too wet. He had not enough flour in it, just as, sometimes, when he and Jan made mud pies, they did not have enough sand or dirt in the water to make the stuff for the pies as thick as they wanted it. So Trouble stirred in more flour, and then, just as you can easily guess, he made it too thick and had to put in more water. By this time, Trouble's small hat was almost full of flour and water, and some dough began to run over the edges, down on his little bare legs, and also on his rompers and on the table, and even to the floor of the kitchen tent. Trouble did not like that. He wanted to get his cake mixed before Nora came back, so she could bake it in the oven for him, for he knew cakes must be baked to make them good to eat, and he really hoped, knowing no better, that his cake would be good enough to eat. Trouble make a big cake, he said, as he slowly put a little more water into his hat and stirred the dough some more. He splashed some of the flour and water on the end of his stubby nose and wiped it off on the back of his hand. Then, as he kept on stirring, some more of the dough splashed on his cheeks, and he had to wipe that off. So that, by this time, Baby William had on his hands and face at least as much dough as there was in the spoon. But finally the little mischief maker got the dough in his hat just about thick enough, not too much flour and not too much water in it. When this point was reached, he knew that it was time to get ready for the baking part, putting the dough in the pans so it would go into the oven. Trouble wanted to do as much toward making his own cake as he could without asking Nora to help. So now he thought he could put the dough in the baking pans himself. But they were on the table beyond his reach. He must get up to reach them. So Trouble got up and then, well, you can just imagine what happened. He forgot that he was holding in his lap the hat full of dough, and as soon as he stood up, of course, that slipped from his lap and the table and went splashing all over the floor. Squish, squish, squash, the hat full of dough dropped. "Oh!" exclaimed Trouble. "Oh!" His feet were covered with the white flour and water. Some splashed on Nora's chair near the table. Some splashed on the table legs, and more spread over the tent floor and ran in little streams toward the far edges. And in the midst of it, like a little island in the middle of a lake of dough, was Trouble's new hat. Only now you could hardly tell which was the hat and which was the dough. "Trouble's cake all gone," said the little fellow sadly, and just as he said that, back came Nora. She gave one look inside her nice, clean tent kitchen. At least it had been clean when she left it, and then she cried, "Oh, Trouble Martin, what have you gone and done?" "Trouble make a cake, but it spill," he said slowly, climbing down from the table. "Spill? I should say it did spill," cried Nora. "Oh, what a sight you are! And what will your mother say?" "What is it now, Nora?" asked Mrs. Martin, who heard the noise in the kitchen. "Oh, it's Trouble, as you might guess. He's tried to make a cake. But such a mess." Mrs. Martin looked in. She wanted to laugh and cry at the same time, but as that is rather hard to do, she did neither. She just stood and looked at Trouble. He had picked up his hat, which still had a little of the paste in it, and this was now dripping down the front of his rompers. "Well, it's clean dirt, not like the time he was stuck in the mud of the brook at home." "That's one consolation," said Nora at last. Nora had a good habit of trying to make the best of everything. "Yes, it's clean dirt and it will wash off," agreed Mother Martin. "But, oh, Trouble, you're such a sight. And so is Nora's kitchen." "Oh, well, I don't mind cleaning up," said the good-natured maid. "Come on, Trouble, I'll let your mother wash you, and then I'll finish the cake." "Make a cake for Trouble?" asked Baby William. "Yes, I guess I'll have to, since you couldn't make one for yourself," laughed Nora. "Never mind. You'll be a man when you grow up, and you won't have to mess around a kitchen. Here you are," and she caught him up, all doughy as he was, and carried him to the big tent where his mother soon had him washed and in clean clothes. Then Nora cleaned up the kitchen and made some real cakes and cookies, which Ted and Jan, as well as Trouble, ate a little later. The Curlytops laughed when told of Trouble's attempt to make a cake, and for a long time after that, whenever they were telling any of their friends about the queer things their baby brother did, they always told first about the cake he made in his hat one day. "Oh, Ted, I know what let's do," cried Janet one day, about a week after Trouble had played with the flour and water. "What?" asked her brother. "Go fishing." "No, I don't like fishing. Anyhow, we went fishing once, and I don't like to see the worms wiggle. Let's make a little play tent for ourselves in the woods. We haven't any cloth. We can make one of leaves and branches, just like the bower we made for Knick-Knack before Grandpa put up the little board barn for him." "Yes, we can do that," agreed Ted. "It'll be fun. Come on." A little later, the two Curlytops were cutting down branches from low trees, sticking the ends into the soft ground, and tying the leafy tops together with string. This made a sort of tent, and though there were holes in it, Where the leaves did not quite come together, it made a shady place. Jan brought in her dolls, and Ted his sailboat and other toys. And there the two children played for some little time. Trouble was not with them. But he'll be along pretty soon, remarked Janet, and he'll want part of the tent for his. Is it big enough for 3, Teddy? Well, we can make Trouble a little bower for himself right next door. He'll want to bring in a lot of old stones and mud pies anyhow, and we don't want them. We'll make a little bower for him when he comes along. So, waiting for their little brother to hunt them out, which he always did sooner or later if they went off to play without him, Ted and Jan had fun in the little leafy house they had made for themselves. They were having a good time, and were wondering if Grandpa Martin would ever find the queer ragged man, or if they would see the strange blue light again, when Jan suddenly gave a scream. "What's the matter?" asked Ted. "Something tickled the back of my neck," explained his sister. "Maybe it's a big worm or a caterpillar. Look, Ted, will you?" Teddy turned to look, but as he did so, he gave a cry of surprise. "It's a goat!" "It's our goat. It's Knick-Knack," yelled Teddy. He stuck his head right through the bower and, oh Jan, he's eating it. And so Knick-Knack was. His head was halfway through the side of the tree tent nearest Jan, and the goat was chewing some of the green leaves. It was Knick-Knack's whiskers that had tickled Jan on the back of her neck. "Whoa there, Knick-Knack," called Ted, as the goat from the outside pushed his way farther into the tent. "Whoa there. You'll upset this place in a minute." And so it seemed Knick-Knack would do, for he was hungrily eating the leaves of the branches from which Jan and Ted had made their playhouse. "How'd he get loose?" asked January. "I don't know," Ted answered. "I tied him good and tight by his rope. I wonder if—" Just then a voice called, "Wait for me, Knick-Knack. Wait for me. It's Trouble," cried Jan and Ted together. Ted looked out through the hole the goat had eaten in the side of the bower and saw baby William toddling toward him. "Did you let Knick-Knack loose?" demanded Ted. "'Es, I did," answered Trouble. "I cut his rope with a knife, I did. I want so wide. Wait for me, Knick-Knack." The goat was in no hurry to get away, for he liked to eat the green leaves, and Ted, coming out of the bower, which was almost ready to fall down now that the goat was halfway inside it, saw where the rope, fast around his pet's horns, had been cut. "You mustn't do that, Trouble," Ted said to his little brother. "You mustn't cut Knick-Knack's rope. He might run away into the lake. Trouble wants a wide." "Well, we'll give you a ride," added January. "But did Mother or Nora give you the knife to cut the rope?" "No. Trouble got knife often table." "Oh, you must never do that," cried January. "You might fall on the sharp knife and cut yourself." Trouble was bad. The little fellow had really taken a knife from the table and had sawed away with it on Knick-Knack's rope until he had cut it through. Then Knick-Knack had wandered over to the green bower to get something to eat, and Trouble, dropping the knife, had followed Mrs. Martin. To punish baby William so he would remember not to take knives again would not let him have a goat ride, and he cried very hard when Ted and Jan went off without him. But even little boys must learn not to do what is wrong, and Trouble was no different from any others. One afternoon, when the Curly Tops had been wandering around the woods of the island, looking to see if any berries were yet ripe, they came back to camp rather tired and warm. "I know what would be nice for you," said Nora, who came to the flap doorway of the kitchen tent. Yes, I know 2 things that would be nice for you. What? Asked Jan, fanning herself with her sunbonnet. I hope it's something good to eat, sighed Teddy, as he sat down in the shade. Part of it, answered Nora. How would you like some cool lemonade, that is, when you are not so warm, she added quickly, for Teddy had jumped up on hearing this, and was about to make a rush for the kind cook. You must always rest a bit when you are so warm from running, walking, or playing before you take a cold drink of anything. But have you any lemonade? Asked Janet, for she, too, was tired and thirsty. I'll make some, and you may have it when you are not so heated, went on the cook. And I'll get some sweet crackers for you. That's nice, said Janet. Are they the 2 things you were going to tell us to do, Nora? No, I'll count the lemonade and crackers as one, went on the cook with a smile. The other thing I was going to tell you to do is to take Knick-Knack and have a ride. That will cool you off if you go in the shade. Oh, so it will, cried Ted. We'll do it. And can we take the lemonade in a bottle and the crackers in a bag and put them in the goat wagon? Do you mean to give the crackers and lemonade a ride, too? Asked Mother Martin, who came out of her tent just then. No, but we can take them with us and have a little picnic in the woods, explained Teddy. We didn't find any berries, and so we didn't have any picnic. All right. Nora, give them the lemonade and crackers to take with them, said Mrs. Martin, smiling at the curly tops. I'll go and make the cool drink now, said the cook. And I'll get the crackers, said the children's mother. And we'll go and get Knick-Knack and harness him to the cart, added Ted. He and Janet were soon on their way to the little leafy bower where the goat was kept. For it was so warm on Star Island that the goat did not stay more than half the time in the stable Grandpa Martin had made for him. Here, Knick-Knack. Where are you? Called Teddy, as he neared the bower. Here, Knick-Knack, called Janet. But the goat did not answer. Nearly always, when he was called to in that way, he did, giving a loud "Baye" that could be heard a long way. Oh! Knick-Knack isn't here, cried Jan, when she saw the empty place. Maybe he's run away, Ted. He must be on the island somewhere, said the little boy. He can't row a boat and get off. And he doesn't like to swim, I guess, though he did fall into the water once. But where is he? Asked Janet. We'll look, Teddy said. So the children peered about in the bushes, but not a sign of Knick-Knack could they see. They called and called, but the goat did not bleat back to them. Oh, where can he be? Asked Janet, and her eyes filled with tears, for she loved the pet animal very much. We'll look, said Teddy. And if we can't find him, we'll ask Grandpa to help us look. They wandered about, but not going too far from the leafy bower, and all at once Ted cried, Hark! I hear him. So do I, added Janet. Oh, where is he? Listen, returned her brother. They both listened, hardly breathing, so as to make as little noise as possible. Once more they heard the cry of the goat. Ba-a-a, went Knick-Knack. Ba-a-a, he's over this way, cried Teddy, and he started to run to the left. No, I think he's here, and Janet pointed to the right. What's the matter, Curly Tops? Asked Mrs. Martin, who came out just then to see what was keeping the children. We can hear Knick-Knack, but we can't see him, answered Ted. Mrs. Martin listened to the goat's call. I think he's down this path, she said, and she took one midway between those Ted and Janet would have taken. Come along. She called back to the two children. We'll soon find Knick-Knack. Here, Knick-Knack. Here, Knick-Knack, called Ted. Come on, we want you to give us a ride, added Janet. But though the goat answered, as he nearly always did, his voice sounded afar off, and he did not come running to see his little friends. Oh, I wonder if anything is the matter with him, asked Ted. We'll soon see, said Mrs. Martin. Just then the barking of a dog was heard. Oh, I wonder if that's Skyrocket, asked Janet. No, we left our dog home, said Mrs. Martin. That sounds like a strange dog. And he seems to be barking at Knick-Knack. Come on, children. We'll see what the matter is. They hurried on, and in a little while, they saw what had happened. Knick-Knack was caught in a thick bush by the rope around his horns. He had pulled the rope loose from his leafy bower, and it had dragged along after him as he wandered away. Then the end of the rope had become tangled in a thick bush, and the goat could not pull it loose. He was held as tightly as if tied. In front of him, but far enough away so the goat could not butt him with his horns, which Knick-Knack tried to do, was a big and not very nice-looking dog. This dog was barking fiercely at Knick-Knack, and the goat could not make him go away. Oh, Mother, don't let the dog hurt our goat, begged Janet. I'll drive him away, cried Ted, catching up a stone. No, you had better let me do it, said Mrs. Martin. She picked up a stick and walked toward the dog, but he did not wait for her to get very close. With a last howl and a bark at Knick-Knack, the dog ran away, jumped into the lake, and swam off toward shore. Then the rope was loosed, and Knick-Knack, who was badly frightened, was led back by Ted and Jan and hitched to the wagon. He then gave them a fine ride. The dog was a stray one, which had swum over from the mainland, Grandpa Martin said. Ted and Janet took the lemonade and crackers with them in the goat wagon and had a nice little picnic in the woods. What can we do today? Asked Janet, as she and Teddy finished breakfast in the tent one morning and, after playing about on the beach of the lake, wanted some other fun. Let's go swimming, cried Teddy, and take trouble with us, added his sister. In their bathing suits and with Nora on the bank to watch them, the children were soon splashing in the cool water. Ted could swim a little bit, and Jan was just learning. Come on out where it's a little deeper, Ted urged his sister. It isn't up to your knees here, and you can't swim in such shallow water. I'm afraid to go out, she said. Afraid of what? Big fish or a crab? Pooh! Those little crabs won't bite you, and when we splash around we scare away all the fish. They wouldn't bite you anyhow. Maybe a water snake would. No, it wouldn't, declared Ted. Come on and see me swim. So Jan waded out a little way with him. Ted was just taking a few strokes, really swimming quite well for so small a boy, when, all at once, he heard a cry from his sister. Oh, Ted, Ted, she called. Come on in, quick. A big fish is going to bite you. Ted gave one look over his shoulder and saw something with a pointed nose, long whiskers, and two bright eyes swimming toward him. Oh, yelled Ted, and he began running for shore as fast as he could splash through the watered Chapter 13 Jan's Queer Ride. What's the matter? What is it? Cried Nora from the bank where she was tossing bits of wood into the lake for Trouble to pretend they were little boats. Have you got a cramp, Teddy boy? It's a big fish or something, he panted, as he kept on running and splashing the water all about, which, after all, did not matter as he was in his bathing suit. "It's a shark after him," cried Jan, who, by this time, was safe on shore, stopping on her way to grasp Trouble by the hand and lead him also to safety. "It's a shark!" She had heard her mother read of bathers in the ocean being sometimes frightened by sharks or by big fish that looked like sharks. "Oh, a shark! Good land. We mustn't bathe here anymore," cried Nora. By this time Ted was in such shallow water that it was not much above his ankles. He could see the bottom, and he hoped no very big fish could swim in so little water. So he thought it would be safe to stop and look back. "Oh, it's coming some more," cried Jan, from where she stood on the bank with Nora and Trouble. "Look, Ted, it's coming. The animal, fish, or whatever it was, indeed seemed to be coming straight for the shore near the place where the curly tops were playing. Ted." Jan and Nora could see the sharp nose and the bright eyes more plainly now. As for Trouble, he did not know what it was all about, and he wanted to go back in the water to wade, which was as near swimming as he ever came. Then the strange creature turned and suddenly made for a small rock which stood out of the water a little way from the sandy beach. It climbed out on the rock while the children and Nora watched eagerly, and then Ted gave a laugh. "Why," he exclaimed, "it's nothing but a big muskrat." "A muskrat?" echoed January. "Yes, and see, he has a mussel or freshwater clam," said Nora. "Look at him crack the shell." And this is what the muskrat was really doing. It had been swimming in the lake, for muskrats are good swimmers when it had found a freshwater mussel, which is like a clam except that it has a longer shell that is black instead of white. Muskrats like mussels, but they cannot eat them in water. They have to bring them up on shore, or to a flat rock or stump that sticks up out of water, where they can crack the shell and eat the mussel inside. "If I'd have known what it was, I wouldn't have been scared," said Ted, who felt a little ashamed of himself for hurrying toward shore. "You frightened me yelling so, January." "Well, I didn't want to see you get bit by a shark, Teddy. First I thought it was a shark." "Well, sharks live in the ocean where the water is salty," declared Ted. "Anyhow, maybe a muskrat bites," went on Janet. "Well, maybe," agreed Ted. "I guess it's a good thing I didn't stay there when he came swimming in, for the big rat passed right over the place where Ted had been about to swim." "I'm glad you yelled, Janet." "So am I. I'm not going in swimming here anymore." "Oh, he won't come back," Ted said. "Come on." But Janet would not go. And as it was no fun for Ted to splash in the water all alone, he stayed near shore and went wading with Trouble and his sister. This was fun, and the curly tops had a good time, while Nora, now that she knew there was no danger from sharks, sat in the shade and mended holes in the children's stockings. "I wish we had a boat," said Ted after a while. "Why, we have," answered January. "Yes, I know, the big rowboat. But that's too heavy for me and you, I mean you and me," and Ted quickly corrected himself, for he knew it was polite always to name oneself last. "But I want a little boat that we can paddle around in." Jan thought for a moment and then cried, "Oh, I know the very thing." "What?" asked Ted eagerly. "One of the boxes Grandpa brought the things in from the store. They're long, and we can make box boats of them. There's 2 of 'em. That's what we can," cried Teddy, as he thought of the boxes his sister meant. Groceries from the store had been sent to the camp in them. The boxes were strong and long, big enough for Jan or Ted to sit down in them and reach over the sides to paddle, not being too high. Mother Martin said they might take the boxes and make of them the playboats they wanted. And in great delight, Ted and his sister ran to get their new playthings. Grandpa Martin pulled out all the nails that might scratch the children, and he also fastened strips of wood over the largest cracks in the boxes. That will keep out some of the water, but not all, he said. Your box boats won't float very long. They'll sink as soon as enough water runs in through the other cracks. Oh, well, we'll paddle in them in shallow water, promised Ted. And sinking won't hurt, 'cause we've got on our bathing suits. Come on, Jan. Trouble wanted to sail in the new boats, also, but they were not large enough for two. Besides, Mrs. Martin did not want the baby to be in the water too much, so she carried him away. Trouble crying and screaming to be allowed to stay, while Jan and Ted got ready for their first trip. They pretended the boats were ocean steamers and that the cove in the lake, near Grandpa's camp, was the big ocean. They had pieces of wood which their grandfather had whittled out for them to use as paddles, and as Ted said, they could sit down in the bottoms of the box boats and never mind how much water came in, for they still had on their bathing suits. All aboard called Teddy as he got into his boat. I'm coming, answered Janet, pushing off from shore. Oh, I can really paddle, cried Ted in delight, as he found that his box floated with him in it and he could send it along by using the board for a paddle as one does in a canoe. Isn't this great, Janet? Oh, it's lots of fun. I'm glad you thought of it. I never would, went on Ted. He was a good brother, for whenever his sister did anything unusual like this, he always gave her credit for it. Around and around in the little cove paddled the Curly Tops, having fun in their box boats. I'm going to let the wind blow me, said Jan after a bit. I'm tired of paddling. There isn't any wind, Ted remarked. Well, what makes me go along, then? Asked his sister. Look, I'm moving and I'm not paddling at all. She surely was. In her boat, she was sailing right across the little cove, and, as Ted had said, there was not enough wind to blow a feather, to say nothing of a heavy box with a little girl in it. Isn't it queer? Exclaimed Janet. What makes me go this way, Ted? You aren't sailing. Ted's boat was not moving now, for he had stopped paddling. Still, Jan's craft moved on slowly but surely through the water. Then Ted saw a funny thing and gave a cry of surprise. Chapter 14, Digging for Gold. What's the matter? Called January. Her boat was now quite a little distance away from her brother's. Do you see anything, Teddy? I see you are being towed, Janet. Being what? Towed pulled along, you know, just like the mules pull the canal boats. Once the Curly Tops had visited a cousin who lived in the country near a canal, and they had seen the mules and horses walking along the canal towpath pulling the big boats by a long rope. Who's towing me? Ted asked Jan, trying to look over the side of her box. But as she did so, it tipped to one side, and she was afraid it would upset, so she quickly sat down again. I don't know what it is, her brother answered, but something has hold of the rope that's fast to the front part of your box, and it's as tight as anything the rope is. Something in the water is pulling you along. On each of the box boats the Curly Tops had fastened a piece of clothesline their mother had given them. This line was to tie fast their boats to an overhanging tree branch near the shore of the cove, when they were done playing. And as Ted had said, the rope fast to the end of Jan's box was stretched out tightly in front, the end being down underwater. Oh, maybe it's the big muskrat that has hold of my rope and is giving me a ride, cried Janet. It's fun. No, I don't guess it's a rat, answered Teddy. A muskrat wouldn't do that. Oh, I see what it is, he cried suddenly. I see it. What? Asked Janet. Again she got up and tried to look over the side of the box, but once more it tipped as though going to turn over, and she sat down. By this time both her box and Ted's was half full of water, and so went only very slowly along the little cove. The weight of the water that had leaked in through the cracks and the weight of the curly tops themselves made the boxes float low in the lake. Can you see what's pulling me? Asked Janet. Yes, answered Teddy, I can. It's a great big mud turtle. A mud turtle, cried Janet. I guess he's scared, too, said her brother, for he's swimming all around as fast as anything. Where is he? Asked Janet. Right in front of your boat. I guess your rope got caught around one of his legs, or on his shell, and he can't get it loose. He must have been swimming along and run into the rope. Or maybe he's got it in his mouth. If he had, he could let go, answered Janet. Oh, I see him, she cried. She had stood up in her box and was looking over the front. The box had now sunk so low in the water that it was on the bottom of the little cove, and no longer was the turtle towing it along. The turtle, finding that it could no longer swim, had come to the top of the water and was splashing about, trying to get loose. Jan could see it plainly now, as Ted had seen it before from his boat, which was still floating along, as not so much water had leaked in as had seeped into his sister's. Oh, isn't it a big one? Cried January. It's a big turtle. It surely is, assented Ted. He could bite hard if he got hold of you. Is he biting my rope? Janet asked. No, it's round one of his front legs, replied Ted. There, he's got it loose. There he goes, shrieked January. By this time the mud turtle, which was a very large one, had struggled and squirmed about so hard in the water that he had shaken loose the knot in the end of Jan's rope. The knot had been caught under its left front leg, and when the turtle swam or crawled along on the bottom, the rope had been held tightly in place, and so the box was pulled along. But when Jan's boat sank and went aground, the turtle could not pull it any farther, and had to back up, just as Knick-Knack the goat sometimes backed up his cart. This made the rope slack or loose, and then the creature could shake the knot of the rope out from under its leg. There it goes, cried Ted, as the turtle swam away. Oh, what a whopper. It's bigger than the big muskrat. Your muskrat didn't give you a ride, Ted, and my turtle gave me a fine one, said January. But I can't sail my boat anymore. Well, we'll have to empty out some of the water. Then it will float again and you can get in it. I'm not going to let the rope drag in the water anymore, decided Janet after Ted had helped her tip her box over so the water would run out. I don't really want any more rides like that. The next turtle might go out into the lake. I want to paddle. I wish a big whale would come along and tow me, laughed Ted. I wouldn't let him go loose. He might pull you all across the lake, Janet said. I'd like that. Come on, we'll have a race. All right, Ted. The Curlytops began paddling their box boats about the cove once more. Ted won the race, being older and stronger than Janet, but she did very well. Then after some more fun sailing about in their floating boxes, the children were called by their mother, who said they had been in the water long enough. Besides, dinner was ready, and they were hungry for the good things Nora had made. "And didn't you find any of them, Father?" asked Mrs. Martin as the farmer pushed back his chair when the meal was over. "No, I didn't see a sign of them, and I looked all over the cave, too. Some persons have been sleeping in there. For I found a pile of old bags they had used for a bed, but I didn't find anyone." "Find who?" Ted inquired. "The tramps, or the ragged man you and Jan saw," answered his grandfather. "I have been looking about the island, but I could not find any of the ragged men, for I think there was more than one. So I guess they've gone, and we needn't think anything more about them." "Did you see the blue light?" asked Ted. "No, I didn't see that either. I guess it wouldn't show in the daytime. But don't worry, just have all the fun you can in camp. We can't stay here very much longer." "Oh, do we have to go home?" cried the curly tops sorrowfully. "Well, we can't stay here much longer," said Mother Martin. "In another month, the weather will be too cold for living in a tent. Besides, Daddy will want us back, and Grandpa has to gather in his farm crops for the winter. So have fun while you can." "Isn't Daddy coming here?" asked January. "Yes. He'll be here next week to stay several days with us. Then he has to go back to the store." The Curly Tops had great fun when Daddy Martin came. They showed him all over the island, the cave, the place where Knick Knack nearly ate up the Bower tent, the place where Ted saw the muskrat, and they even wanted him to go riding in the box boats. "Oh, I'm afraid I'm too big," laughed Daddy Martin. "Besides, I'd be afraid if a mud turtle pulled me along." "Oh, Daddy Martin, you would not," laughed Janet. And so the happy days went by, until Mr. Martin had to leave Star Island to go back to his business. He promised to pay another visit, though, before the camp was ended, several times. Before and after Daddy Martin's visit, Ted and Jan talked about the queer ragged man they had seen and about the blue light and the cave. "I wonder if we'll ever find out what it all means," said January. "It's like a storybook, isn't it, Ted?" "A little, yes. But Grandpa says not to be scared, so I'm not." "I'm not either. But what do you suppose that ragged man is looking for, and who is the professor?" Teddy did not know and said so. Then, when he and Jan got back to the tent, having been out with Trouble for a ride in the goat cart, they found good news awaiting them. "Here is a letter from Hal Chester, the little boy who used to be lame," said Mrs. Martin, for Grandpa had come in, bringing the mail from the mainland post office. "Oh, can he come to pay us a visit?" asked Ted. His mother had allowed him to invite Hal. "Yes, that's what he is going to do," went on Mrs. Martin. "His doctor says he is much better and can walk with hardly a limp now. And the trip here will do him good. So tomorrow Grandpa Martin is going to bring him to Star Island." "Oh, goody," cried Ted and Jan, jumping up and down and clapping their hands. Trouble did the same thing, though he did not know exactly what for. "We'll have fun with Hal," cried Ted. "Maybe he'll help us find the tramp man. Hal's smart, he can make kites and lots of things." The next day Hal Chester came to visit the camp on Star Island. "Say, this is a dandy place," he exclaimed as he looked about at the tents and at the boat floating in the little cove. "I'll just love it here." "It's awful nice," agreed January. "And there's a mystery here, too," added Ted. "What do you mean?" Hal demanded. What's a mystery? Oh, it's something queer, went on Ted. Something you can't tell what it is. This mystery is a tramp. A tramp? Yes! Jan saw him when she was picking flowers, and he pulled trouble out of the spring afterward. And there's a cave here where maybe he sleeps, 'cause there's some bags for beds in it. He's looking for something on this island, that tramp man is, declared Ted. Looking for something? Repeated Hal, quite puzzled. Yes, he goes all around, and we saw him picking up some stones. Didn't we, Jan? Yes, we did. Picking up stones, repeated Hal slowly. Then he sprang up from where he was sitting under a tree with the curly-top children. I know what he's looking for. Hal cried. What? Gold, and Hal's voice changed to a whisper. That tramp knows there's gold on this island, and he's trying to dig it up so you won't know it. He's after gold, that's what he is. Oh, gasped Jan, her eyes shining brightly. Oh, exclaimed Ted. Can't we stop him? This is Grandpa's island. He mustn't take Grandpa's gold. There's only one way to stop him, said Hal quickly. How? Demanded Ted and Janet in the same breath. We'll have to dig for the gold ourselves. Come on, let's get some shovels and we'll start right away. It must be up near the cave. Come on, we'll dig for the gold ourselves. Chapter 15. The big hole. Hal Chester was very much in earnest. His eyes shone and he could not keep still. He fairly danced around Janet and Ted. Do you really think that Tramp Man was looking for gold? Asked Ted. Deed I do, declared Hal. What else was he after? Neither Ted nor Janet could answer that. But how will we know where it is? Asked Janet. We don't know where there's any gold, and Mother won't want us to go near that tramp man. And I don't want to, either, answered Hal. But we can dig down till we find the gold, can't we? If we knowed, I mean if we knew where to dig, agreed Ted, after thinking about it. But digging for gold isn't like digging for angleworms to go fishing. You can dig them anywhere. But you've got to have a gold mine to dig for gold. Well, we'll start a mine, decided Hal. That's what the miners do out west. I read about it in a book at the home when I was crippled and couldn't walk much. The miners just start to dig, and if they don't find gold in one place, they dig in another. That's what we'll do. We'll dig till we find the gold, then we'll have a gold mine. Oh, yes, let's do it, cried January. I'd love to have some gold to make a pair of bracelets for my doll. Pooh, scoffed Ted. If we get gold, we aren't going to waste it on dolls' bracelets. Are we, Hal? Well, if Jan helps us dig, she can have her share of the gold. That's what miners always do. They divide up the gold and each one takes his share. Of course Jan can do what she likes with hers. There, see, Mr. Smarty, cried Jan to her brother. I'll make my gold into dolls' bracelets. Maybe you won't get any, objected Ted. Well, I'll help you dig, anyhow. I helped Grandpa dig trenches around the tents so the rainwater would run off, and I can help dig a gold mine. I know where the shovels are. Good, cried Hal. We don't want any girls in this gold mine, objected Ted, as his sister hurried off to where Grandpa Martin kept the shovels, hoes and other garden tools he used about the camp. Usually Ted did not mind what game his sister played with him. But since Hal had spoken of gold, the little curly-top boy had acted differently. We don't want girls in the gold mine, repeated Ted. Course we do, laughed Hal. Jan's a strong digger. And I can't do very much, as my foot that used to be lame isn't all well yet. It used to be almost as strong as the other, but now it isn't. So you and Jan will have to do most of the digging. Though I can shovel away the dirt. Anyhow, they always have girls or women in gold camps, you know. They do, cried Ted. Of course. They do the cooking where there aren't any Chinamen. Mostly Chinamen do the cooking in gold camps, but we haven't any, so we'll have to have a girl. She can be January. There's a Chinaman who washes shirts and collars in our town, remarked Ted. Maybe we could get him to cook for us. No. What's the use when we've got Jan? Anyhow, it'll be only make-believe cooking, and I don't guess that shirt Chinaman would want to come here just for that. Anyhow, we'd have to pay him, and we haven't any money. We'll get some out of the gold mine, Ted answered. Well, maybe we won't find any gold for a week or so. Does it take as long as that? Oh, yes. Sometimes longer. And that Chinaman would want to be paid for his cooking every week, or every night maybe. We won't have to pay January. That's so. Well, then I guess she can come. But we can get my mother or Nora to make us sandwiches, and we won't have to cook much of anything. That's what I thought, Teddy. But we can let Jan set the table and things like that when she isn't digging. She'll help a lot. Yes, she's almost as strong as I am, agreed Ted. Hurry up, Jan, he called. Got those shovels yet? Yes. But I can't carry 'em all. You must help. Come on. Jan was walking back toward the boys, dragging 2 heavy shovels. Seeing this, Hal hurried to help her and Ted followed. They got another shovel and a hoe, and with these they started off toward the cave, about which Ted had told Hal. That'll be the place where the gold is, decided the visitor. The tramps must have been looking for it there. We'll start our gold mine right near the cave. What about something to eat? Asked Ted. Pausing as they started up the path that led to the hole out of which the cave opened. That's so. We ought to have something. I'm getting hungry now, remarked Jan. Though it was not long since they had had a meal. So am I, announced Ted. Better not stop to go back for anything to eat now, decided Hal. Your mother or grandma might make us stay in camp. Did you tell them we were going to dig for gold, Jan? No. I didn't see any of them when I got the shovels. Well then, we'll go on up to the cave. One of us can come back later and get something to eat. They call it grub in the books. Call what grub? Ted asked. Stuff the miners eat. We'll send Jan back for the grub after we start the gold mine. You're going to be the cook. Hal informed Ted's sister. I am not, she cried, dropping her shovel. I'm going to be a gold miner just like you two. If I can't be that, I won't play, and I'll take my shovel right back. So there now. Oh! You can be a gold miner too, Hal made haste to say. But we've got to have a cook, they always do in a gold camp. Well, I'll be a cook when I'm not digging gold, agreed January. But I want to get enough for my doll's bracelets. That's all right, agreed Hal. It would not do to have Jan leave them right at the start. If Mrs. Martin or Grandpa saw the children starting out with hoe and shovels, they probably thought the curly tops were only going to dig fish worms, as they often did. Grandpa Martin was very fond of fishing, but he did not like to dig the bait. But Trouble was fretful that day, and his mother had to take care of him. So she did not pay much attention to Jan or Ted, feeling sure they would come to no harm. So on the 3 children hurried toward the hole into which Ted had fallen just before they found the queer cave. This is just the place for a gold mine, cried Hal when he looked at the ground around the big hole. I guess someone must have started a mine here once before. It does look so, agreed Ted. Let's go into the cave, proposed the visitor. No, Grandpa told us we must never go in without him, objected January. It's all right to stay outside here and dig, but we mustn't go inside. The tramps might be in there. That's right, chimed in Ted. We'll stay outside. Hal was not very anxious himself to go into the dark hole, so they looked at the place where Ted had fallen through the loose leaves and talked about whether it would be better to start to make that hole larger or begin a new one. The children decided the last would be the best thing to do. We'll start a new mine of our own, said Hal. I guess maybe somebody dug there and couldn't find any gold, so we'll start a new mine. This suited the Curlytops, and they soon began making the dirt fly with shovels and hoe, digging a hole that was large enough for all three of them to stand in. Hal said they didn't want to start by making too small a mine. If we've got to divide it into 3 parts, we want each one's part big enough to see, he said, and Ted and Jan agreed to this. The ground was of sand and very easy to dig. There were no big rocks, only a few small stones, and of course this was just what the children liked. So that in about half an hour they had really dug quite a deep hole. It was almost as easy digging as it is in the sand at the seashore, and if any of you have been there, you know how soon. Even if you use only a big clam shell for a shovel, you can make a hole deep enough for you and your playmates to stand up in. Do you see any gold yet? Asked Jan of the 2 boys. When they had dug down so that only the top parts of their bodies were out of the big hole. No, not yet. But we'll come to it pretty soon, Hal said. Say, how are we going to get up when the hole gets too deep? Asked Ted. We ought to have a ladder or something. There's a ladder in camp, answered January. Grandpa had it when he put up our real rope swing. Don't you remember, Ted? Yes, that's right. We'd better get it if we're going any deeper, Hal, he added. Course we're going deeper. Gold mines are real deep. I guess the ladder would be a good thing. Then we'll go for it. Jan, you can come and get us something to eat, too. I'm awful hungry. So am I, said Hal. While Jan was in the tent kitchen begging Nora for some cookies and sandwiches, Ted and Hal carried the small ladder, which was not very heavy, up to the big hole they had started. By putting one end of the ladder down inside, allowing it to slant up to the top of the hole, the children could easily get down in and climb up. After they had eaten the things Jan got from Nora, they began digging again. The hole was soon so deep that the dirt which was shoveled and hoed away from the bottom and sides could no longer be tossed out by Ted and January. We've got to get a pail and hoist up the dirt, decided Hal. That's what they do in gold mines. One of us must stay at the bottom and dig the dirt and fill the pail, and the other pull it up by a rope. We'll take turns, said Teddy. And I want to help, too, cried Jan, so the boys agreed to let her, especially as they had seen that she could dig and toss dirt almost as well as they could. They found an old pail and part of a clothesline for the rope, and the work at the gold mine, as they called it, went on more merrily than before. By this time the hole was really quite deep, so deep that Hal Chester could not see over the rim when he stood up straight on the bottom. And only by using the ladder could the children get down and up. We ought to find gold pretty soon now, said Hal, as he climbed up to let Ted take a turn at going down in the hole and digging. Just then from the camp they heard the sound of the supper bell. Come on, called Ted, not waiting to go down into the big hole. We can dig some more after supper and tomorrow. I'm hungry. So am I, agreed Hal. Leaving their shovels and the hoe on the pile of dirt, the children hastened down to the tent where Nora had supper waiting for them, and it had a most delicious smell. "Where have you children been?" asked Mrs. Martin. "Oh, having fun," answered Ted. "Don't forget your curly top," warned his mother with a laugh. "Are you hungry, Hal?" "Indeed I am. This island is a good place for getting hungry. And this is a good place to be stopped from getting hungry," laughed Grandpa Martin, as he pulled his chair up to the well-filled table near which Nora stood ready to serve the meal. The Curly Tops and Hal had just a little idea that the grown folks would not like their plan of digging a gold mine, so nothing was said about it. "Hal,